Hey there, tonight we're diving into the tale of the American dollar. What you're about to discover is how a scrappy piece of paper transformed into a global heavyweight, not exactly the fairy tale version you've heard. If these stories help you unwind, I'd love a quick like or subscribe, but only if they're genuinely working for you. I'm curious where in the world you're listening from, so drop your location and local time in the comments. It's amazing seeing our little community span the globe through these historical tales. Now find your comfort zone, perhaps turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's venture into tonight's story together. Currency. It's the stuff that makes the world go round, or at least the stuff that makes shopping trips less awkward than trading a goat for your groceries. But before the dollar swaggered onto the scene with its stars and stripes, the American colonies were a hodgepodge of barter systems and foreign coins, like a flea market where everyone's bargaining in different languages. This chaotic currency landscape set the stage for the birth of the almighty dollar, a tale that's as much about ambition as it is about the occasional lapse in judgment. Back in the pre-colonial days, if you wanted to buy something, you had to get creative. You couldn't just slap down a crisp bill and call it a day. Instead, you might trade beaver pelts, tobacco, or even wampum, those decorative shell beads that were the closest thing to a universal currency among Native American tribes. Talk about making it rain, 17th century style. The English settlers, however, weren't exactly thrilled to be living in a world where their wallets were filled with what looked like arts and crafts supplies. They wanted shiny metal coins, the kind that jingled in your pocket and didn't smell like the back end of a muskrat. Enter the Spanish dollar, also known as the Piece of Eight. If there was a currency popularity contest in the 18th century, the Spanish dollar would have taken the crown and sash. It was widely accepted and easily divisible, which made it the unofficial superstar of the American colonies. You could slice it like a pizza into 8 pieces, or bits, hence the term 2 bits, meaning a $0.25. It was so popular that it influenced the design of the U.S. dollar. The Spanish dollar was like the cool foreign exchange student everyone wanted to hang out with, while the local currency was the awkward kid trying to figure out social cues. Colonial currency, on the other hand, was a nightmare that would make any modern economist break out in a cold sweat. Each colony had its own currency, and they were backed by different things: land, commodities, or just good old-fashioned hope. It was like a financial version of Game of Thrones, with everyone wanting to sit on the Iron Throne of monetary supremacy. Massachusetts was the first to print its own paper, money, in 1690. Bold move considering the ink wasn't even dry before people started questioning its worth. Fast forward to the Continental Congress in 1775, where the founding fathers sat around pondering how to fund a revolution on a shoestring budget. Their solution? Print more money, of course. This was a time before anyone had invented the concept of inflation as we know it today, so they printed continental currency with reckless abandon. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well. By 1781, the phrase, "not worth a continental," became the colonial equivalent of saying something was as useful as a chocolate teapot. Prices skyrocketed, and the currency collapsed faster than a sandcastle at high tide. The Continental Congress's decision to churn out money like it was going out of style was a bit like trying to put out a fire with gasoline. They printed $241 million worth of paper currency, which doesn't sound like much compared to today's trillions. But remember, this was when a loaf of bread cost about a shilling, and a dollar was a small fortune. The gamble was that the colonies would win the war, and the new nation would back up the currency. But with no gold or silver to prop it up, the paper money was as flimsy as a politician's promise. The chaos of colonial currency and the misguided optimism of the Continental Congress are why the dollar's story is as much about learning from mistakes as it is about bold innovation. The Spanish dollar set the stage, providing a model of what currency could be: stable, reliable, and universal. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress's experiment in printing paper money taught a valuable lesson about the perils of inflation and the importance of backing your currency with something more than just good intentions and wishful thinking. As the sun set on the colonial era, the stage was set for the American dollar to step into the spotlight, but not before a few more twists in the tale. Fledgling nation, needed a currency that could unify its people and stabilize its economy, something that could stand the test of time and the scrutiny of skeptics. The journey from wampum and beaver pelts to the greenbacks in your wallet today was just beginning. But as the founding fathers learned, creating a currency that people actually trust is no small feat. After all, money might make the world go round, but only if it's backed by more than just paper and promises. While the founding fathers were busy penning the Constitution and arguing over just how united these United States would actually be, there was another pressing issue at hand: money, honey. Fresh off the Revolution, the new nation found itself in a financial quagmire that was as murky as the Delaware River on a foggy morning. The war had emptied the coffers, and the states were still bickering like siblings over who owed what to whom. Enter Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury's first celebrity, and the man who'd eventually get his face on the $10 bill, which is quite the achievement for someone who spent most of his life trying to make sure currency didn't go the way of the dodo. Hamilton was the kind of guy who could probably balance a budget in his sleep. As the first Secretary of the Treasury, he had a vision for an American financial system that was both ambitious and, frankly, a tad bit controversial. He believed in a strong central government and a robust federal bank, a concept that made some folks as nervous as a cat in a room full of rocking chairs. But the man had a plan, and his plan was the Coinage Act of 1792. This was no small feat. It was the legislative equivalent of building the country's financial foundation from scratch. The act established the U.S. Mint and introduced the American dollar as the standard unit of money. The dollar was to be backed by precious metals, specifically gold and silver, ensuring that the currency would hold real value, not just the empty promises of governments past. The Coinage Act of 1792 was signed into law by President George Washington. Yes, the same guy who couldn't tell a lie about cherry trees, and it laid out some very specific details. For starters, it created the U.S. Mint, which was tasked with producing coins in gold, silver, and copper. The act also established the dollar as the principal unit of currency, subdivided into dimes, cents, and mills, which sounds like the setup for a math problem no one wants to solve. The dollar was pegged at 75 grains of pure gold, or 371. 25 grains of pure silver, which might sound like a lot of grains, but remember, this was before the age of paper money and digital transactions. Cold, hard cash was literally cold and hard. Hamilton's plan was not without its critics. Some thought his ideas were as outlandish as a $3 bill. Thomas Jefferson, for instance, was wary of a national bank and preferred states' rights to federal oversight. He and Hamilton were like the original odd couple, with Jefferson as the laid-back farmer and Hamilton as the uptight banker. But Hamilton was nothing if not persistent. He knew that for the young republic to thrive, it needed a currency that was as strong and reliable as the ideals on which it was founded. Creating a mint wasn't just about coining money, it was about coining trust. The U.S. Mint began operations in 1793, and the first coins struck were made of copper, simple, functional, and frankly, a bit dull. It wasn't until 1794 that the mint produced its first silver dollars, and these were the coins that really got people talking. The design featured Lady Liberty on one side and an eagle on the other, a symbol of freedom and strength that resonated with the American public. Only about 758 of these silver dollars were minted in 1794, making them as rare as hen's teeth today, and worth a fortune to collectors who can afford to drop a cool $10 million on a single coin. But let's not romanticize the process too much. The mint was plagued by challenges from the get-go. There were issues with sourcing enough gold and silver to meet demand, and the technology of the era meant that producing coins was a labor-intensive process. The early mint workers were more akin to blacksmiths than the high-tech operators of today. There was also the matter of decimalization, which, believe it or not, was a hot topic of debate. Some folks thought it was downright un-American to decimalize currency, preferring the good old British system of pounds, shillings, and pence. But Hamilton, ever the forward thinker, pushed for a decimal system, which is why today we have 10 dimes to the dollar and not 12 pence to the shilling. Hamilton's vision was a currency system that was both practical and patriotic, and though it faced its fair share of opposition, it ultimately laid the groundwork for the modern American economy. The Coinage Act of 1792 was the first step in unifying the nation under a single, stable currency, and it marked the beginning of the end for the chaotic mishmash of colonial and foreign currencies that had been in use up to that point. In the years that followed, the U.S. Mint would go on to produce some of the most iconic coins in American history, from the Liberty Head nickels to the famous Morgan dollars. Each coin was a tiny, metal testament to the country's resilience and ingenuity. And while Hamilton didn't live to see the full fruits of his labor, he was killed in a duel with Aaron Burr in 1804, a story that could fill a whole podcast episode on its own. His legacy lived on every time someone flipped a coin or paid for their morning coffee with a dollar bill. As the U.S. Mint churned out more coins and the economy began to stabilize, the American dollar gained a reputation for being as solid as a rock, a currency you could trust. The transition from a chaotic colonial currency system to a unified national one was not without its bumps and bruises, but it was a necessary evolution for a nation finding its footing in a rapidly changing world. The Coinage Act of 1792 marked a turning point in American history, setting the stage for the dollar to become not just a symbol of economic strength, but a powerful tool for unity and national identity. So next time you pull out a dollar bill or hear someone refer to cold hard cash, remember that it all started with a visionary named Hamilton, a mint in Philadelphia, and a nation determined to forge its own financial path. And while the story of the dollar is far from over, the Coinage Act of 1792 was the opening chapter in a saga that continues to unfold to this day. As we look back on those early days, it's clear that the journey from colonial chaos to monetary stability was as much about the people and their ideals as it was about the coins they carried in their pockets. And so, the saga of the American dollar marched into the 19th century, where it encountered a banking system that could rival any soap opera for drama and unpredictability. If the previous century was about getting the dollar up and running, the 1800 were about keeping it from running off a cliff. It was a wild era where banks popped up as frequently as pop-up ads and were often just as reliable. Enter the era of wildcat banks, colorful in name and questionable in practice. These banks were often set up in remote areas, theoretically to avoid pesky regulators, but more practically because they had as much in common with legitimate financial institutions as a cat has with a wildcat. They issued their own banknotes, backed by little more than the founders' enthusiasm and a lot of hot air, leaving customers holding paper that was about as valuable as a polite promise. It was the financial equivalent of a game of musical chairs, and when the music stopped, many found themselves without a seat and without their savings. Amidst this chaos, the dollar was in desperate need of a hero, or at least someone who could keep it from turning into monopoly money. But instead of a hero, it got Andrew Jackson. Now, Jackson was a man who knew how to hold a grudge, especially against banks. His distrust of centralized banking was legendary, fueled by a mix of personal vendettas and a populist disdain for anything that smacked of elitism. He saw the Second Bank of the United States as a monster, a hydra-headed beast that needed slaying. His weapon of choice, veto power. In 1832, Jackson vetoed the renewal of the Second Bank's charter, and by 1836, he had effectively dismantled it. This move was as controversial as pineapple on pizza, and it divided public opinion just as fiercely. But Jackson was not one to back down, and his dismantling of the bank was a statement that echoed through the financial halls of history, that centralized banks were as welcome in his America as a skunk at a garden party. Not surprisingly, the fallout from Jackson's war on the bank was a doozy. Without a central bank to regulate currency and credit, the financial system was left as wobbly as a newborn calf. And then came the panic of 1837, a financial crisis that hit harder than a hangover on New Year's Day. The panic was triggered by a perfect storm of speculative lending, plummeting cotton prices, and an abrupt tightening of credit. The economy shrank faster than a wool sweater in a hot wash, leading to widespread bank failures, unemployment, and a recession that lasted a brutal 5 years. The Panic of 1837 was a painful reminder that while the dollar might have been minted with the best of intentions, it was still subject to the fickle whims of economic forces and human folly. It was a lesson in financial humility, an uncomfortable realization that the dance of commerce was as much about avoiding missteps as it was about making the right moves. Amidst the economic turmoil, there emerged a shimmering beacon of financial hope, the gold standard. By the mid-19th century, the gold standard had become the baiense of economic policies, universally admired, often imitated, and surprisingly controversial. The idea was simple: tie the value of the dollar to a fixed quantity of gold. This would prevent the kind of rampant inflation that had plagued the continental currency and ensure that the dollar was backed by something more substantial than paper and promises. Gold was the ultimate arbiter of value, a shiny constant in a world of monetary uncertainty. It was a policy that promised stability and confidence, the financial equivalent of a warm blanket on a cold night. But like any good idea, it had its detractors. Critics argued that tying currency to gold limited economic flexibility, making it harder to respond to recessions and financial panics. It was like strapping the economy into a financial straitjacket, comforting to some, constraining to others. As the dollar continued its journey through the 19th century, it did so with the gold standard as its guiding star. This era saw the rise of national banks, the expansion of the railroads, and the growth of industry, all contributing to an economy that was as dynamic as it was unpredictable. By the time the dust settled, the American dollar had emerged both scarred and seasoned, ready to face the challenges of the modern era with a newfound resilience. Yet, even as the dollar found its footing, it remained a symbol of the nation's ongoing struggle to balance innovation with stability, ambition with responsibility. The story of the dollar in the 19th century was a testament to the power of currency to shape a nation's destiny and the importance of learning from the past to build a more secure future. In the end, the dollar's tale is one of constant reinvention, a narrative that reflects the evolving character of a nation striving to find its place in an ever-changing world. And while the tale is far from over, the 19th century was a chapter that underscored the importance of vigilance, adaptability, and the occasional willingness to challenge the status quo. As the American dollar moved forward, it carried with it the lessons of its tumultuous past, serving as a reminder that the journey of currency is as much about the people who use it as the metal it's minted from. As the 19th century slipped into the rearview mirror and the 20th roared into view, the American dollar was about to take center stage in the global economic arena. It was a time when the world seemed to be speeding up, not unlike swapping a horse and buggy for a Model T. Enter the Federal Reserve in 1913, the financial equivalent of installing central heating in a drafty old mansion. This institution was designed to stabilize the economy, regulate currency, and generally act as the adult in the room when bank panics threatened to turn the financial system into a circus. The Federal Reserve, or the Fed as it's affectionately known, was born out of necessity. The Panic of 1907, a financial crisis that had the stock market teetering like a drunk on a tightrope, made it crystal clear that the U.S. needed a centralized banking system. J.P. Morgan, the financial titan of the time, had to step in personally to bail out banks, which was a bit like asking your rich uncle to lend you rent money. Helpful, but not sustainable. The Federal Reserve Act was signed into law by President Woodrow Wilson, and the Fed was tasked with providing the country with a safer, more flexible, and more stable monetary and financial system. It was like finally getting a financial babysitter after years of wildcat bank parties. Yet, no sooner had the ink dried on the Federal Reserve Act than the world was plunged into chaos with World War I. The war was a seismic event that shook the economic landscape like an earthquake. The U.S. dollar, however, emerged relatively unscathed, largely due to America's late entrance into the conflict and its role as a primary supplier to the war-torn Allies. By the end of the war, the U.S. had transitioned from a debtor nation to a creditor nation. The dollar was beginning to flex its muscles on the world stage, setting the scene for its eventual role as the global financial heavyweight. But of course, the 1920s were nothing if not unpredictable. The decade began with a roar, and the Roaring Twenties lived up to its name with jazz, flappers, and bootleg liquor fueling a cultural revolution. Economically, it was a time of great prosperity, or at least the illusion of it. Stock prices soared, and speculation was the name of the game. It was a financial bubble that had all the structural integrity of a soap bubble on the breeze. When the bubble burst in 1929, it wasn't just a pop. It was a thunderclap that ushered in the Great Depression. The Great Depression was the financial equivalent of a prolonged root canal, with the economy contracting like a frightened turtle. Unemployment soared to 25%, and banks folded like cheap lawn chairs. People who had once been riding high on the stock market roller coaster found themselves staring into the financial abyss. And amidst this economic carnage, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stepped into the spotlight with his New Deal, an ambitious program of economic reform aimed at pulling the country out of the doldrums. Yet one of FDR's most controversial moves was his gold confiscation policy in 1933. In what might be considered the original cash for gold scheme, the government demanded that citizens turn in their gold coins, bullion, and certificates in exchange for paper currency. The Gold Reserve Act of 1934 followed, officially taking the U.S. off the gold standard for domestic purposes. This was a strategic move to increase the money supply, combat deflation, and give the government more control over monetary policy. Americans were now required to trust that their paper money was worth its face value, even if it no longer jingled like gold in their pockets. For FDR, it was a gamble that paid off, at least partially. The economy slowly began to recover, though it wasn't until World War II that the U.S. fully emerged from the Great Depression's shadow. The war effort created jobs, spurred industrial production, and transformed the dollar into the dominant global currency. By the end of the conflict, the Bretton Woods Agreement of 1944 had firmly established the dollar as the world's reserve currency, pegged to gold, and other currencies pegged to the dollar. The greenback was now the belle of the global economic ball, and America stood as the undisputed financial leader. The irony of the dollar's ascent was that it coincided with the U.S. abandoning the gold standard, a move that had seemed as radical as suggesting that bread could be made without yeast. By tying the world's currencies to the dollar, and thus indirectly to gold, the Bretton Woods system aimed to promote international monetary cooperation and prevent the kind of chaotic currency wars that had preceded World War II. As the world moved into the latter half of the 20th century, the dollar faced new challenges, from the oil shocks of the 1970s to the rise of global competitors. But its journey through the first half of the century had transformed it from a national currency to a global powerhouse. The dollar had weathered wars, depressions, and political upheavals, proving its resilience time and time again. Yet, even as the dollar enjoyed its status as the world's reserve currency, questions lingered about the sustainability of this system in an increasingly interconnected world. Could the dollar maintain its dominance in a landscape of emerging economies and shifting alliances? As the 20th century drew to a close, the story of the dollar was far from finished, and its future remained as unpredictable as the markets it helped to shape. In the end, the story of the American dollar is a testament to innovation, resilience, and the ever-present tension between stability and change. It's a narrative that reflects the broader story of America itself, a nation constantly reinventing itself, striving to balance its ideals with the realities of a complex and often unforgiving world. As we look to the future, the dollar's journey continues, a symbol of not just economic power, but the enduring spirit of adaptability and ambition. And so, as the 20th century turned over its last few pages, the American dollar was sitting pretty atop the global financial throne, a crown of greenbacks gleaming from sea to shining sea. But nothing in the world of economics stays golden forever, especially not when Richard Nixon, Tricky Dick himself, decided to shake up the status quo. Picture it. The year is 1971, and the U.S. economy is grappling with inflation harder than a summer in Death Valley. Nixon took a look at the gold standard and decided it was about as useful as a chocolate teapot. In a move that sent shockwaves through the financial world, Nixon announced the temporary suspension of the dollar's convertibility into gold. This temporary measure was about as temporary as your Aunt Edna's fruitcake. It stuck around permanently. It was the economic equivalent of ripping off a Band-Aid and leaving the wound to the mercy of the elements. This bold move, often referred to as the Nixon shock, effectively ended the Bretton Woods system, severing the dollar's ties to gold and letting it float freely in the choppy seas of international exchange rates. Now, why would Nixon do such a thing? Well, the U.S. was facing a gnarly balance of payments deficit, and gold reserves were dwindling faster than ice cream on a hot sidewalk. The dollar needed to be set free to devalue and make U.S. goods cheaper abroad, boosting exports and hopefully bringing some balance back to the books. In theory, it was a sound economic strategy. In practice, it was like opening Pandora's box. Currencies around the world were suddenly forced to rethink their relationship with the dollar, and global markets reacted with all the grace of a cat tossed in a swimming pool. By decoupling from gold, the dollar became more of an idea than a physical entity. Its value was now determined by market forces, supply and demand, confidence and speculation. A high-stakes game of economic poker where the ante was global prosperity. The dollar's new free-floating status allowed for greater flexibility in economic policy, but it also introduced a new level of unpredictability. The dollar was now a currency that could rise and fall on the whims of market sentiment, geopolitical events, and the occasional presidential tweet. Despite the initial turbulence, the dollar emerged from this upheaval with its global dominance intact. It was like a boxer who takes a punch, wobbles, but doesn't hit the mat. The 1980s and 1990 saw the dollar solidify its status as the linchpin of international finance, bolstered by the United States' economic might and political influence. The creation of the petrodollar system, where oil was traded exclusively in dollars, further cemented its role as the world's reserve currency. Oil, that precious black gold, became yet another jewel in the dollar's crown, ensuring that countries around the globe needed to hold dollars to fuel their economies. But don't be fooled into thinking the dollar's journey was all smooth sailing from here. As the 21st century dawned, the financial world was hit with the kind of drama that makes reality TV look like a Sunday picnic. Enter the 2008 financial crisis, a meltdown of epic proportions that had economists and bankers worldwide clutching their pearls. It was sparked by the subprime mortgage disaster, an unholy cocktail of greed, risky lending, and financial alchemy that turned American homes into ticking time bombs. The crisis was the financial equivalent of a slow-motion car crash, with global repercussions. Banks failed, markets plummeted, and economies teetered on the brink of collapse. It was a stark reminder that even the mighty dollar was not immune to the consequences of unchecked financial excess and regulatory failure. Yet, in the midst of chaos, the dollar proved once again to be the survivor, the go-to haven for investors seeking stability in a world gone mad. When the dust settled, it was the dollar that stood resiliently amid the wreckage, a testament to its enduring appeal and the trust it commanded globally. And then came the digital age, where the dollar found itself sharing the stage with a new kind of currency, cryptocurrency. Bitcoin, born in 2009 in the wake of the financial crisis, was a direct challenge to traditional fiat currencies. Created by the enigmatic Satoshi Nakamoto, Bitcoin promised a decentralized, peer-to-peer currency free from the meddling hands of governments and central banks. It was digital money for a digital world, a revolution wrapped in code. But while Bitcoin and its ilk captured the imagination of tech enthusiasts and libertarians alike, they also faced skepticism from those who viewed them as little more than glorified monopoly money. Yet, for all the hype and headlines, cryptocurrencies have yet to dethrone the dollar. Despite Bitcoin's meteoric rise and the proliferation of altcoins, the dollar remains the heavyweight champ, the currency that underpins international trade and finance. It's as if the dollar took one look at Bitcoin and said, "Nice try, but I've been around the block a few times." The reality is that while cryptocurrencies offer intriguing possibilities, they also come with volatility and uncertainty that make them a risky alternative to the tried and true dollar. So, what is it about the dollar that gives it such staying power? Well, it's more than just the strength of the U.S. economy, though that's certainly a big part of it. The dollar's dominance is also about trust, a commodity more valuable than gold, especially in the unpredictable arena of global finance. Countries and investors around the world have confidence in the stability of the dollar and the U.S. government's ability to manage its currency. It's this trust that keeps the dollar in demand, despite the occasional economic hiccup or geopolitical storm. As we wrap up this whirlwind tour of the dollar's storied history, one thing is abundantly clear. The American dollar is more than just a piece of paper or a digital entry in a bank's ledger. It's a symbol of resilience and adaptability, a testament to the power of trust and stability in a world that often seems anything but. From its humble beginnings as a colonial experiment to its current status as the global financial powerhouse, the dollar's journey is a reflection of the broader story of America itself, a nation constantly evolving, always striving to balance its ideals with the realities of an ever-changing world. In the end, the dollar's legacy is one of continuous reinvention and survival. It's a narrative that speaks to the enduring human pursuit of progress, the willingness to adapt in the face of new challenges, and the tenacity to thrive in an unpredictable world. As we look to the future, the dollar's story is far from over, and its next chapter promises to be just as intriguing as those that came before. So, whether you're a history buff, an economics enthusiast, or just someone with a curiosity about the world, remember that the dollar is more than just currency. It's a living piece of history, a reflection of our past, and a beacon guiding us into the future. Charlemagne, a name that sounds like it could be a brand of expensive cologne, actually belonged to one of medieval history's biggest hitters, a king who would eventually style himself as Emperor of the Romans. But hold your horses. Before we get to the fancy emperor bit, we need to start with the less glamorous early days. In 768, Charlemagne, or Charles, as his mom probably called him when he was in trouble, inherited the Frankish kingdom. This kingdom wasn't some quaint little hamlet. It sprawled across a significant chunk of modern-day France, Germany, and parts of Italy. But here's the kicker. He didn't get to rule it solo. He had to share the royal babysitting duties with his younger brother, Charlemagne. Now, you'd think sharing a kingdom would be all about diplomatic dinners and joint policy-making sessions. But in reality, it was more like a medieval version of sibling rivalry on steroids. Imagine the chaos of two brothers trying to share a single Game of Thrones-style throne. Charlemagne and Charlemagne were about as harmonious as two cats in a sack. Charlemagne, the lesser-known sibling, didn't have the same flair for leadership that Charlemagne did, and their relationship was less about brotherly love and more about who could outmaneuver whom at every turn. They were like medieval rock stars who couldn't quite agree on the set list. Their partnership came to a sudden and rather convenient end in 771 when Charlemagne died quite unexpectedly. The cause of his death remains a mystery, though in true Game of Thrones fashion, speculation ranges from natural causes to perhaps a little help from, well, let's just say, ambitious parties. Charlemagne, not one to let a good opportunity pass him by, swiftly moved to consolidate his power, taking over his brother's share of the kingdom. And just like that, the Frankish kingdom had its solo act. With Charlemagne out of the picture, Charlemagne wasted no time in flexing his muscles. His first target, the Lombards. These guys were hanging out in northern Italy, minding their own medieval business. But Charlemagne had bigger plans. You see, conquering the Lombards wasn't just about adding more land to his map. It was also about cementing his position as the top dog in Europe. Plus, the Pope had a bit of a vested interest in this scrap. The Lombards were a persistent thorn in the papal side, and a united Frankish front was just what the Pope ordered. Cue Charlemagne's first campaign in 773 AD. With an army that wasn't exactly known for its subtlety, he marched across the Alps. Picture this. Thousands of warriors clanking their way through mountain passes, probably cursing the weather and the terrain more than the enemy. But the Lombards weren't exactly a pushover. The siege of Pavia, their capital, dragged on for over a year. Talk about overstaying your welcome. However, persistence paid off, and by 774, Charlemagne was crowned king of the Lombards. Not the most elegant of coronations. Imagine being crowned king in a city you just spent a year pounding into submission. Now, let's talk medieval diplomacy, which was less about shaking hands and more about exchanging hostages. In Charlemagne's world, a peace treaty wasn't worth the parchment it was scrawled on unless you had a few hostages to ensure good behavior. It was a keep your friends close and your enemies' children closer kind of strategy. And boy, was it effective. Charlemagne had a knack for turning foes into allies, or at least into people who wouldn't stab him in the back immediately. Despite his successes, Charlemagne's rise to power wasn't all glorious battles and diplomatic victories. Remember, this was the medieval era, where the line between a grand coronation and a chaotic farce was thin, very thin. His coronation as king of the Lombards, for instance, was less about pomp and circumstance, and more about making sure the Lombards knew who was boss. There's nothing quite like being crowned king in a hall that still smells of yesterday's siege. Charlemagne's early reign was a masterclass in ambition, strategic marriages, and a fair bit of luck. He had the vision to expand his empire, the cunning to outmaneuver rivals, and the audacity to claim land and titles as if he were picking up groceries. But let's not romanticize it too much. The political landscape of the time was a messy tapestry of alliances, betrayals, and the occasional mysterious death that would give any modern soap opera a run for its money. Charlemagne wasn't just playing a Game of Thrones, he was rewriting the rulebook as he went. Charlemagne was just getting warmed up, and while the Lombards were busy licking their wounds, he was already eyeing his next prize. Enter the Saxons, a group whose idea of hospitality didn't include welcoming foreign armies with open arms. The Saxons were a tenacious bunch, clinging to their pagan traditions like a toddler to a favorite toy, while Charlemagne had a vision of a Christian empire. Cue the infamous 30-year-long game of tug-of-war, also known as the Saxon Wars. This wasn't your average medieval skirmish. It was a perpetual cycle of conquest and rebellion, with Charlemagne playing the part of the exasperated parent constantly putting out fires. From 772 to 804, Charlemagne's army marched into Saxony more times than a teenager sneaks out past curfew, with varying degrees of success. The Saxons, led by their chief Widukind, were formidable, often retreating into their dense forests like guerrilla fighters, striking when least expected. And forget about the romanticized notion of chivalrous battles. This was brutal, dirty warfare, where the winner was often the one who could outlast the other. Now, let's pause to appreciate what goes into such a lengthy campaign. Imagine trying to keep an army fed, clothed, and ready for battle without the luxury of modern supply chains. There were no medieval MREs or DoorDash deliveries to the front lines. Feeding an army involved a logistical ballet of foraging, requisitioning supplies from local villages, sometimes voluntarily, other times not so much, and hoping the cows didn't go on strike. It was a tapestry of logistical nightmares that would make any modern quartermaster weep. While these campaigns were costly, both in terms of lives and treasure, they were also a testament to Charlemagne's relentless ambition. He implemented a series of harsh laws to force the Saxons into submission, including the infamous Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae. This decree was about as subtle as a sledgehammer, stipulating the death penalty for anyone refusing baptism. Charlemagne's brand of diplomacy was more convert or else than let's talk about it over coffee. But military campaigns weren't all doom and gloom. Enter the Battle of Roncesvalles Pass in 778, a debacle so epic it inspired centuries of storytelling. Picture this. Charlemagne's army, fresh from a somewhat successful jaunt into Spain, was ambushed while retreating through the Pyrenees. The attackers, band of Basque warriors who knew the terrain like the back of their hand. It was a classic case of hit them where it hurts, and Charlemagne's rearguard bore the brunt of the attack. Here's where myth and reality collide in a spectacular fashion. The battle, though a minor skirmish in the grand scheme of things, birthed the Song of Roland, an epic poem that transformed the event into a chivalric saga. Roland, the hero of this tale, was a real historical figure, a commander under Charlemagne. However, the poem paints him as a paragon of knighthood, blowing his elephant horn valiantly as he faces overwhelming odds. In reality, Roland probably had more in common with a medieval logistics officer than a superhero, but why let facts get in the way of a good story? As the empire expanded, so did the economic challenges. Charlemagne's realm wasn't built on goodwill and fairy dust. It required a robust tax system to keep the wheels turning. This meant everyone from peasants to nobility had to contribute their fair share, or whatever the king deemed fair. The empire's economy was a complex web of obligations, with landowners providing troops and resources in exchange for protection and political favor. It was the medieval version of a subscription service, except you couldn't cancel if you didn't like the terms. Maintaining such a sprawling domain demanded more than just military might. It required a keen understanding of governance. Charlemagne's administration was a patchwork of local laws and customs, unified under a central authority. He sent out missi dominici, royal envoys tasked with ensuring that his edicts were enforced across the empire. Think of them as medieval auditors, but with more swords and less paperwork. These envoys were crucial in maintaining the king's influence, acting as his eyes and ears in distant provinces. Yet, for all his administrative savvy, Charlemagne's rule was anything but a utopia. Heavy taxation was a constant burden on the populace, and the threat of rebellion simmered just beneath the surface. In an era where loyalty was often secured through fear rather than love, Charlemagne had to walk a fine line between ruler and tyrant. His empire was a marvel of medieval engineering, held together by a combination of brute force and strategic alliances. But let's not forget the human side of this grand narrative. Charlemagne, though a formidable leader, was also a man of contradictions. He was a devout Christian who could be ruthless in his pursuit of power, a king who valued learning in an age of illiteracy, and a conqueror who sought to unify a fragmented Europe. His legacy is a complex tapestry, woven with threads of ambition, faith, and an occasional splash of unintended comedy. As we delve deeper into the saga of Charlemagne, it becomes clear that his story is not just about a king expanding his realm. It's a tale of a man grappling with the monumental task of forging an empire from the chaos of the Dark Ages. With each campaign, each battle, and each decree, he etched his name into the annals of history, not as a flawless hero, but as a leader willing to reshape the world according to his vision, one conquest at a time. And while his methods may have been as subtle as a medieval battering ram, there's no denying the indelible mark he left on the tapestry of European history. As Charlemagne's conquests stretched his empire across Europe like a medieval game of Risk, he realized that brawn alone wasn't going to cut it. Ruling a vast domain was a bit like trying to babysit a bunch of hyperactive toddlers. You need rules and a semblance of order. Enter Charlemagne's domestic agenda, which included a buffet of legal reforms and cultural revivals that would make any modern politician drool. First up, Charlemagne tackled the legal system, or rather, the lack of one. The Frankish kingdom was a patchwork quilt of laws, with each region having its own set of rules, often based on tribal customs. Imagine trying to govern an empire where one village's idea of justice involved a trial by combat, while the next village over preferred a good old-fashioned dunking in the river. Charlemagne, ever the pragmatist, saw the need for a unified legal code. So, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work, creating the capitularies, a series of decrees that laid down the law across his empire. These weren't just dusty scrolls gathering medieval cobwebs. They were living documents, updated regularly to keep up with the times. Think of them as the ancient world's equivalent of software updates, minus the annoying pop-up reminders. But Charlemagne wasn't just about laying down the law, he also had a soft spot for culture. Enter the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of learning and arts that was like the 8th century version of a TED talk. Our medieval Europe wasn't exactly known for intellectual pursuits. Picture more pitchforks than pens. Charlemagne had a vision of a cultured court. He gathered scholars from all over Europe, like Alcuin of York, a name that sounds more like a character from a J.K. Rowling novel than a real-life monk. Alcuin was the intellectual muscle behind Charlemagne's cultural makeover, overseeing the creation of schools and the copying of classical texts. Now, before we start painting Charlemagne as a bespectacled bookworm, let's debunk a romantic notion. His support for learning wasn't purely altruistic. Sure, he liked the idea of a learned court, but there were practical perks too. Educated clergy and officials meant better governance and record-keeping, which was crucial for managing an empire that stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube. Plus, Literacy was a nifty tool for spreading Christianity, something Charlemagne was quite keen on, given his penchant for converting pagans at sword point. Speaking of governance, Charlemagne's administrative system was a comedic masterpiece in complexity. At the heart of it was a web of counts and missi dominici. Think of the counts as regional managers and the missi dominici as the pesky auditors who showed up unannounced. The idea was to keep tabs on local affairs and ensure that the emperor's decrees weren't just being used as kindling. The missi dominici traveled in pairs, one layman and one cleric, a buddy carp duo of sorts, tasked with inspecting everything from justice to tax collection. It's like a medieval version of a road trip, except instead of singing along to the radio, they were reciting laws and checking inventory. Despite Charlemagne's best efforts, running an empire wasn't all sunshine and roses. The administrative challenges were as tangled as a knight's chainmail after a long day of battle. For every decree Charlemagne issued, there were local lords with ideas of their own, often involving more power and less oversight. And let's not forget the logistical nightmare of communication in a world without email or even reliable postal service. Sending a message across the empire was a bit like playing a game of telephone, where by the time it reached its destination, who knows what had been lost in translation. Economically, Charlemagne's empire was a beast that required constant feeding. The system of feudal obligations was the medieval version of a subscription service, where local lords provided troops and resources in exchange for protection and prestige. But this wasn't a one-size-fits-all arrangement. Each region had its own quirks, and keeping everyone happy, or at least not openly rebellious, was a delicate balancing act. Charlemagne's solution, an economy based on land, loyalty, and a little bit of medieval arm-twisting. As for Charlemagne himself, he was a man of contradictions, a ruler who could be both enlightened and ruthless, a patron of learning who barely learned to write his own name. His vision for a unified Europe was as ambitious as it was unprecedented, and while his methods were sometimes as subtle as a battering ram, there's no denying the legacy he left behind. Charlemagne's empire was a patchwork of cultures, laws, and languages, all held together by the sheer force of his will and the not-so-gentle nudge of his armies. The so-called Carolingian Renaissance wasn't just about rediscovering classical knowledge. It was about laying the groundwork for a more centralized and educated administration. Charlemagne's emphasis on education, while impressive, was born out of necessity as much as it was out of any idealistic vision of a learned society. It was about creating a cadre of officials who could read, write, and enforce the emperor's will. The romantic image of Charlemagne as a patron of learning is certainly appealing, but the reality is that his cultural reforms were deeply entwined with the practicalities of ruling an empire. Charlemagne's court became a center of intellectual and artistic activity, with scholars flocking to the emperor's side like moths to a flame. They worked diligently, copying and preserving ancient texts, some of which might have been lost forever if not for their efforts. This wasn't just about saving the past, though. It was about forging a new future. Charlemagne's reforms laid the foundation for what would eventually become the universities of medieval Europe. It's a testament to his vision that, in a time when most people were more concerned with surviving than studying, he saw the value in education as a tool for empire building. But let's not get too carried away with the romance of it all. The reality of Charlemagne's reign was that it was a constant juggling act, balancing the needs of an expanding empire with the demands of a diverse and often unruly populace. His administrative system, while innovative, was also riddled with challenges. The counts and missi dominici were essential for maintaining control, but they also represented a significant drain on resources. Keeping them supplied with food, horses, and the occasional bribe was a logistical nightmare that would make any modern bureaucrat break into a cold sweat. And then there were the economic challenges. Charlemagne's empire was built on a foundation of agriculture, with wealth measured in land and livestock rather than gold or silver. This made resource management a bit like trying to herd cats, with local lords often more interested in their own gain than the emperor's grand vision. Balancing these competing interests required a deft touch and a willingness to make tough decisions, something Charlemagne was never shy about. All the while, Charlemagne had to deal with the ever-present threat of rebellion and invasion. His empire, while impressive, was also a prime target for opportunistic neighbors looking to carve out their own slice of the pie. Keeping the peace was as much about diplomacy as it was about military might, with Charlemagne often relying on strategic marriages and alliances to secure his borders. As we continue our journey through Charlemagne's reign, it's clear that his story is one of both legend and reality, a tale of a ruler who dared to dream big, even as he grappled with the harsh realities of ruling a sprawling empire. His legacy is a complex tapestry woven with threads of ambition, faith, and practicality, creating a picture that's as fascinating as it is flawed. And while Charlemagne might not have been the perfect ruler, his impact on European history is undeniable, setting the stage for the centuries to come. As we venture further into Charlemagne's saga, it's time to tackle one of history's most intriguing alliances, the bromance, albeit with a touch of medieval backstabbing, between Charlemagne and the Church. This tale isn't just a footnote in history. It's the stuff of legends, with all the drama of a political thriller. Fast forward to the year 800 AD, a time when Europe was more fragmented than your grandma's jigsaw puzzle. Enter Pope Leo Roman III, a man with more issues than a tabloid magazine. Leo was in a bit of a pickle, facing rebellion and an attempted blinding by Roman nobles who weren't exactly fans of his papal policies. Desperate, and probably with a few bruises, he fled to Charlemagne, seeking refuge and, more importantly, support against his adversaries. Charlemagne, ever the opportunist, saw a golden ticket in Leo's predicament. Sure, there was genuine piety there, but let's not kid ourselves. This was also about power. By backing the Pope, Charlemagne wasn't just collecting ecclesiastical brownie points. He was cementing his influence over Rome. It was a chess game with higher stakes than a Vegas poker table. In a move straight out of a medieval political playbook, Charlemagne marched down to Rome in late 800 AD. Picture it, the Frankish king, flanked by an entourage that would put any rapper's crew to shame, arriving in the Eternal City to restore order and, naturally, showcase his might. By Christmas Day, Charlemagne found himself at the grandest ceremony of his life, his coronation as Emperor of the Romans. Now, here's where the myth meets reality. The story goes that Charlemagne was caught by surprise when Leo Roman III placed the imperial crown on his head during the Christmas service. Some accounts claim he might have said, "If I'd known this was going to happen, I would have worn my fancy shoes." But let's face it, Charlemagne was no naive bystander. The political implications were as clear as a medieval tapestry. He was reviving the Western Roman Empire under his rule, a flex that would make even the most ambitious Roman emperors nod in approval. The newly minted Holy Roman Emperor title was a game-changer, and not just because it sounds like something straight out of a fantasy novel. It was a masterstroke of political theater. Suddenly, Charlemagne wasn't just a king. He was an emperor with a divine mandate. It gave him the clout to tell other European rulers, "Step aside. I've got the Pope's backing," while simultaneously making Rome a cornerstone of his expanding empire. The irony. Despite the grandeur of the ceremony, Charlemagne's relationship with the Church was more complicated than a soap opera subplot. His alliance with Pope Leo Roman III wasn't all prayers and psalms. Sure, they shared mutual benefits. Charlemagne got legitimacy, and Leo got protection, but it was also fraught with tension. The Church wanted influence over the empire, while Charlemagne wasn't about to let anyone, not even the Pope, dictate his rule. Economically speaking, the alliance was a jackpot. Control over vast territories meant more resources, more trade, and more opportunities to fill the imperial coffers. Charlemagne was no fool. He knew that aligning with Rome meant tapping into a network that was as old as the empire itself, a network that could bolster his economic and political ambitions. Yet, it's essential to debunk the romantic notion of a harmonious church-state relationship. Charlemagne was a pragmatic ruler who knew how to leverage the Church's influence without becoming its puppet. He implemented policies that favored the Church, but ensured that ultimate authority rested with the crown. It was a delicate dance of give and take, with Charlemagne leading and the Church following to the best of its ability. In the grand narrative of history, Charlemagne's coronation as Holy Roman Emperor is often painted as a moment of divine destiny. The reality, though, is that it was a calculated move in a much larger game of power. The title gave Charlemagne the legitimacy to rule not just by might, but by divine right, a concept that would echo through European history for centuries. So, while the legend of Charlemagne might cast him as a reluctant hero, thrust into the limelight by a scheming pope, the reality is far more nuanced. He was a shrewd politician who understood the value of an imperial title and the benefits of a papal alliance. His relationship with the Church was not just about faith, but about power, both earthly and divine. As we continue to unravel the story of Charlemagne, it becomes clear that his empire wasn't just built on the battlefield, but in the corridors of power, where alliances were forged and crowns were bestowed. It was a world where the lines between myth and reality blurred, creating a legacy that would endure long after Charlemagne had taken his final bow on the stage of history. And while the romance of an emperor crowned on Christmas Day is undeniably appealing, the true story is one of strategy, ambition, and a man who understood that power was as much about perception as it was about reality. And so, with his imperial crown shining like a beacon of divine approval, Charlemagne embarked on what could be described as the medieval equivalent of empire management on hard mode. You see, for all the pomp and circumstance of a shiny new title, actually running an empire that spanned from the Pyrenees to the Danube was about as straightforward as herding cats with a lasso made of spaghetti. Charlemagne might have been the newly anointed Holy Roman Emperor, but the reality was that keeping this vast domain under control was a daily grind filled with more headaches than glory. Fast forward a few decades, and Charlemagne's grand empire was facing the kind of existential crisis that would make any CEO reach for the aspirin. By the time of his death in 814, Charlemagne had managed to keep things relatively stable, but the cracks in his empire were already starting to show. The old emperor passed away at the ripe old age of 71, a remarkable feat in an era where most people were lucky to see their 50th birthday. His death, however, was the starting pistol for a race to the bottom among his heirs. You think sibling rivalry in your family is bad? Try being one of Charlemagne's grandsons. Enter the Treaty of Verdun in 843, a historical event that was less about peace and more about grudging compromise. The treaty divided Charlemagne's once mighty empire among his three grandsons, Charles the Bald, Louis the German, and Ladier I. Picture the scene. Three grown men, each one trying to grab the biggest slice of the pie, while simultaneously eyeing each other's portions with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for the last slice of pizza at a frat party. This division was a geographical jigsaw puzzle that left a legacy of fragmentation. And let's be honest, it was a bit like trying to untangle a ball of yarn tossed around by a very enthusiastic kitten. The Treaty of Verdun essentially carved the empire into three distinct entities: West Francia, East Francia, and Middle Francia. West Francia would one day become France, East Francia would evolve into Germany, and Middle Francia. Well, it was doomed to become a historical footnote, a bit like the middle child at a family reunion. Ladier, who got the short straw with Middle Francia, found himself ruling over a stretch of land that was as coveted as it was indefensible. The region was a patchwork of territories that included the Low Countries, Lorraine, and parts of Italy. It was a kingdom that looked great on a medieval map, but was about as stable as a house of cards in a wind tunnel. This division didn't just reflect the personal ambitions and rivalries of Charlemagne's grandsons. It was a reflection of the political realities of the time. Keeping such a vast empire together was a Herculean task, and without a central figure like Charlemagne to hold it all in place, the cracks quickly turned into chasms. The romantic notion of a unified Carolingian empire was just that, a romantic notion. The reality was a mess of local lords with their own agendas, neighbors with boundary issues, and a political landscape that was as treacherous as it was diverse. Yet, even as his empire crumbled like a stale cookie, Charlemagne's legacy refused to fade into obscurity. His reign had set the stage for the Europe we know today, and his influence echoed across the centuries like a particularly catchy chorus. Charlemagne had laid the groundwork for the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would muddle its way through European history for another 1,000 years. And while his immediate successors might have fumbled the imperial ball, the concept of a united Christian Europe under a single ruler would linger in the collective imagination, a dream that would inspire countless leaders in the centuries to come. Let's not gloss over the irony here. Charlemagne, a ruler who spent much of his life waging wars and consolidating power, will be remembered as the father of Europe, a title that suggests unity and harmony rather than division and discord. It's a bit like calling Genghis Khan the patron saint of diplomacy. But that's the beauty of history, a tapestry woven from threads of reality and myth, where the rough edges are smoothed over by the passage of time. So, what's the takeaway from this medieval saga? Charlemagne's story is a testament to human ambition, a cautionary tale of how power, no matter how grand, is always subject to the whims of time and circumstance. His empire was a marvel of its age, a patchwork of cultures and peoples held together by the sheer force of his will. But empires, like all things human, are ephemeral. They rise, they fall, and they leave behind echoes that shape the world long after their banners have faded. Charlemagne's life and legacy remind us that history is as much about the people who lived it as it is about the events themselves. It's about ambition and failure, vision and blind spots, unity and division. And while Charlemagne might not have lived to see the full impact of his reign, he left a mark that endures to this day, a mark that tells us as much about the complexities of power as it does about the enduring appeal of a good story. In the end, Charlemagne was a man of his time, a ruler who dreamed big, played hard, and left a legacy that was as complicated as it was influential. His empire might have fragmented, his grandsons might have squabbled, but the idea of a united Europe under a single leader would continue to captivate and inspire. And perhaps that's the greatest irony of all, that a king who struggled to keep his empire together in life would become a symbol of unity in death. It's a legacy as rich and varied as the history he helped shape, a legacy that invites us to keep turning the pages of history, always seeking the next chapter in the story of Europe. Europe in the early 1400 was a bit like a very exclusive club, you know, the kind where the password is in Latin and no one can remember it. Books were a rare luxury, the kind that only monasteries, universities, and the obscenely rich could afford. Picture a time when reading was practically an Olympic sport, and that's if you could even get your hands on a book to begin with. Manuscripts were painstakingly copied by hand, a process that required the patience of a saint and the eyesight of a hawk. Scribes, those poor souls, hunched over their desks in scriptoriums, which were basically medieval sweatshops for literature, spending months or even years on a single book. A Bible, for instance, could take a good scribe about a year to copy. By then, the poor guy's eyes were probably more bloodshot than a college student during finals week. But let's talk economics, because nothing says riveting history like the price of books in the 15th century. It's hard to imagine today when a paperback costs less than a movie ticket, but back then, a book could cost as much as a farm. Seriously, owning a book was like owning a Tesla, if Teslas back then were handwritten by monks. The cost wasn't just in the labor, materials mattered too. Parchment, made from animal skins, was the paper of the day and was about as cheap as a gold-plated diamond. It was an investment, a commitment, and not something you'd want to accidentally drop in your bathtub. Now, let's zoom into Mainz, Germany, where a young lad named Johann Gutenberg was growing up. Born around 1400, Gutenberg was the son of a patrician family, which meant he wasn't exactly eating gruel for breakfast. His family was involved in the cloth trade, a decent business back when fashion was dictated by how many layers you could wear without passing out. But young Johann had other ideas. He wasn't content to follow in the family footsteps. And it's a good thing, too, because who would have thought that a cloth merchant's kid would one day change the world? Family drama. Oh, there was plenty. You see, the Gutenberg family was part of the patrician class, but they weren't exactly rolling in it like the Medici. There was some tension with the guilds, those medieval labor unions that could make or break a business. Johann's father, Friel Gensflesch zur Leyden, try saying that 3 times fast, had his own run-ins with the guilds, which likely gave Johann an early education in the art of negotiation, or more likely, the art of avoiding a good old-fashioned medieval brawl. Johann, ambitious, and perhaps a bit of a dreamer, left Mainz around 1428, likely due to some political strife involving the local guilds. This wasn't just a move down the street. We're talking about relocating to Strasbourg, over 100 miles away. Back then, that distance was practically another continent. In Strasbourg, Johann didn't just twiddle his thumbs. He got involved in metalworking and learned a thing or two about minting coins. Little did he know, this would be like a masterclass in the skills he'd need to revolutionize the world of books. Let's face it, if ever there was a time ripe for disruption, it was 15th century Europe. The Renaissance was just warming up, and people were hungry for knowledge, literally starving for it. Universities were popping up like mushrooms after a rainstorm, and with them, a demand for books that scribes simply couldn't keep up with. The stage was set for someone with the right mix of ambition, skill, and maybe a touch of madness to shake things up. And good old Johann, he had all three in spades. But here's the catch. Johann Gutenberg didn't start out as a darling of the printing world. He was a man with a vision, sure, but also a man with some serious financial woes. Think of him as the original startup entrepreneur, complete with investors, prototypes, and a few lawsuits for good measure. But all that's yet to come. For now, we have a young man with a head full of ideas and the determination to change the world, one painstakingly crafted letter at a time. And so, with a head full of ideas and a determination that could put a terrier to shame, Johann Gutenberg embarked on his mission to revolutionize the world of books. This was no small feat, mind you. We're talking about an era where the most high-tech gadget was a candle, and most folks thought movable type sounded more like witchcraft than innovation. But Johann wasn't just any ambitious dreamer. He was a man with a plan, and a pretty smart one at that. Now, let's get into the nuts and bolts, or should I say, the metal letters, of Gutenberg's masterpiece, the movable type printing press. The concept was simple, yet brilliantly complex. By creating individual letters that could be rearranged and reused, Gutenberg turned the laborious task of bookmaking into something resembling a medieval assembly line. This wasn't about reinventing the wheel. It was about giving the wheel a swift kick into the future. Gutenberg's press combined several key elements: movable type, a screw press borrowed from the world of winemaking, because why not, and oil-based ink. The movable type was crafted from a metal alloy, typically an amalgam of lead, tin, and antimony, chosen for its durability and ease of casting. Gutenberg's skill in metallurgy, a little something he picked up during his Strasbourg days, proved invaluable here. He designed a hand mold, an adjustable contraption that could churn out identical letters, ensuring uniformity and precision, two qualities sorely lacking in hand-copied manuscripts. And then there was the ink. The ink, the unsung hero in Gutenberg's arsenal. Unlike the water-based inks used by scribes, which had a nasty habit of smudging all over parchment, Gutenberg's concoction was oil-based. It clung to metal type like a toddler to its favorite blankie. This innovation was crucial because it adhered well to the rag paper of the time, a cheaper alternative to parchment and one that didn't require the sacrifice of entire herds of goats. But let's not sugarcoat it. The path to printing glory was paved with potholes. Imagine trying to run a medieval Kickstarter to fund a project that most people couldn't even understand. That's right, Johann had to secure investors. Hardly a walk in the park when everyone thought you were a few sheets shy of a full choir. One of his early backers was the wealthy financier Johann Fust. Think of Fust as the venture capitalist of his day, only with more doublets and fewer PowerPoint presentations. Fust loaned Gutenberg 800 guilders, a hefty sum roughly equivalent to a few $100,000 today, making it clear that this was no casual investment. But money wasn't the only issue. There were technical hurdles too, like ensuring the press applied just the right amount of pressure to transfer ink from type to paper without turning the whole operation into a Rorschach test. Gutenberg had to experiment, tweak, and refine his equipment. No small task when every adjustment required painstaking manual labor. And then there was the matter of public opinion. Not everyone was thrilled about Gutenberg's invention. Scribes were understandably miffed, as this new technology threatened to render their painstaking craft obsolete. Imagine being a master craftsman, only to watch some upstart with a fancy gadget do in weeks what took you years. It's no wonder they weren't exactly lining up to celebrate Johann's success. Even the church, the biggest customer of books at the time, had its reservations. While the prospect of cheaper, more widely available religious texts was appealing, the idea of words being mass-produced felt a tad sacrilegious. After all, if just anyone could print a Bible, What would stop them from printing, say, the medieval equivalent of a tabloid? It was a slippery slope that made many a cleric nervous. Yet, despite the naysayers and the technical challenges, Gutenberg forged ahead. His vision was as clear as the ink stains on his hands. In 1455, he unveiled the Gutenberg Bible, a masterpiece of design and innovation. Consisting of 286 pages, it was hailed for its clarity and beauty, setting a new standard for printed books. And while only about 180 copies were printed, this was a revolution in action. For the first time, books could be duplicated with ease, making knowledge accessible beyond the cloistered walls of the elite. However, the triumph of the Gutenberg Bible was bittersweet. Johann's partnership with Fust turned sour, leading to a lawsuit that stripped Gutenberg of his workshop. In a twist worthy of a courtroom drama, Fust claimed Johann had mismanaged funds, and when the dust settled, it was Fust and his son-in-law Peter Schurfer who ended up with the press. Talk about a hostile takeover. Despite this setback, Gutenberg's legacy was already cemented. His inventions sparked a printing revolution that would spread like wildfire across Europe. By 1500, just a few decades after the first Gutenberg Bible rolled off the press, there were over 250 printing shops in Europe, producing more than 20 million volumes. The floodgates of knowledge had opened, and there was no turning back. So, what can we take away from Johann's tale? Here was a man who saw a problem, envisioned a solution, and pursued it with relentless determination. He faced financial ruin, skepticism, and more than a few raised eyebrows, only to emerge as one of history's most influential figures. The printing press was more than just a machine. It was a catalyst for change, paving the way for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. It transformed how people consumed information and democratized knowledge in a way that was previously unthinkable. But let's not get too starry-eyed. While Gutenberg's invention was indeed groundbreaking, it didn't instantly usher in an age of enlightenment. Books were still expensive, and literacy rates didn't skyrocket overnight. The printing press was a tool, a powerful one, but it was society that wielded it, for better or for worse. The road to a literate, informed public would be long and winding, fraught with obstacles and setbacks. In the end, Johann Gutenberg was a man of his time and a man ahead of his time. His vision, tenacity, and willingness to push boundaries laid the groundwork for a new era. It's a reminder that innovation often requires not just a spark of genius, but the grit to see it through. And while Johann may not have lived to see the full impact of his creation, the world he left behind was undeniably changed, one printed page at a time. While Johann Gutenberg was busy revolutionizing the world one printed page at a time, the production of the Gutenberg Bible was unfolding like a medieval thriller with more plot twists than a season finale of your favorite drama series. Let's jump into the fray, where the stakes were as high as the pile of debt Gutenberg was amassing. First, we need to talk about the financial side of things, or as Gutenberg might have called it, his personal nightmare. Printing wasn't just about squeezing ink onto paper, it was an expensive, high-risk venture. Imagine trying to launch a startup today with nothing but a brilliant idea, a prototype, and a checkbook that's already threatening to bounce. Johann needed capital, and lots of it, to get his printing press off the ground, not to mention the production of the first major book to roll off its metal type. The now famous 42-line Bible, better known as the Gutenberg Bible. Enter Johann Fust, the investor who would eventually become Gutenberg's financial frenemy. Fust wasn't your average medieval moneylender. He was a wealthy goldsmith and financier, and when he first met Gutenberg, he probably saw dollar signs, or rather, guilder signs, dancing before his eyes. In 1450, Fust lent Gutenberg an initial sum of 800 guilders. To put that into perspective, it was like handing out a small fortune, equivalent to a few $100,000 today. And just like any savvy investor, Fust expected a return on his investment. But let's face it, Gutenberg's operation was more of a gamble than a sure bet. Now, this wasn't just a one-time payday loan to tide Johann over. Our man Gutenberg needed a sustained cash flow to keep the presses running, buy materials, and pay his workers. You see, printing was costly. The metal for the type, the ink, the paper or parchment, each was a significant expense. And let's not forget the labor. Back then, he couldn't just post a job listing online. He had to recruit skilled craftsmen, which was no small feat, considering many of them were probably skeptical about this so-called newfangled technology. As the years rolled on and the debt piled up, Gutenberg was running out of time. By 1452, he'd borrowed another 800 guilders from Fust, doubling down on his financial obligations. You could say Gutenberg was living life on the edge, but we're pretty sure he wasn't feeling very adventurous, more like a man trying to keep his head above water with a stone tied around his neck. And here's where things get juicy. Johann Fust, whose name, let's be honest, sounds like it was plucked straight out of a villain roster, wasn't just sitting around waiting for his investment to grow. In 1455, he took Gutenberg to court, accusing him of mismanaging funds. Fust had expected a timely payback on his loans, and when that didn't happen, he decided to pull the legal trigger. The lawsuit was less about who was right and more about who had the deeper pockets and sharper legal skills. Spoiler, it wasn't Gutenberg. The court's decision was less a ruling and more like a financial guillotine for Johann. He lost his workshop, his precious press, and effectively his life's work. Fust and his son-in-law, Peter Schurfer, took over the operation, leaving Gutenberg out in the cold. It was a hostile takeover, worthy of the cutthroat business world today. But instead of boardrooms and stock options, it was workshops and printing presses. But let's not get too bogged down in the financial drama, because the real story here is about Gutenberg's masterful creation. The Gutenberg Bible was no ordinary book. It was a technical and artistic triumph, each copy a work of art. Gutenberg's press could produce up to 240 pages a day, a feat that would have been impossible for any scribe. The final product was a 2-volume set, with each Bible containing over 200 pages. Today, only 49 copies are known to exist, and they remain some of the most valuable books in the world. One sold for a cool $5. 4 million back in 1987. The Bible's production was a meticulous process. Gutenberg used black and red inks, with some copies featuring illuminated initials added by hand after printing. The text was printed in a 2-column format, each column featuring 42 lines, hence the name 42-line Bible. The paper was high-quality rag paper, a significant improvement over parchment. This wasn't just a book. It was a statement, a declaration that the world of books was entering a new era. The impact of the Gutenberg Bible can't be overstated. It was the first major book printed with movable type in the West, a technological leap that made books faster and cheaper to produce. This meant that knowledge could be disseminated on a scale never before imagined. It was like the Internet of the 15th century, a tool that would eventually democratize access to knowledge. But let's not romanticize it too much. Initially, only about 180 copies were produced, and they were still pretty expensive. Most people couldn't just waltz into a shop and pick one up, and here's where we bust a few myths. Gutenberg's press didn't immediately change the world. For starters, literacy rates didn't skyrocket overnight. Most of Europe's population was still illiterate, and even for those who could read, books remained a luxury. The printing press was a tool, and like any tool, it needed time and the right conditions to create widespread change. Despite the setbacks and the eventual loss of his press, Gutenberg's legacy was already taking root. His invention planted the seeds for the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the scientific revolution. The ripple effects of his work would continue to shape the world long after he was gone. In 1468, Gutenberg passed away, likely never realizing just how far-reaching his impact would be. But in the grand tapestry of history, his chapter was just beginning. As we leave Johann to rest in peace, the story of the printing revolution is still unfolding. The presses he inspired would continue to roll, spreading ideas and challenging the status quo. Next up, we'll witness how this new technology influenced everything from religion to politics, and how the printed word became a force to be reckoned with. Stay tuned, because the plot is about to thicken. As the ink dried on Gutenberg's final page, the printing press was already spinning the threads of a new European tapestry. This wasn't just a ripple, it was a cultural tsunami. Suddenly, books weren't the exclusive property of the rich and religious elite. They were creeping into the hands of the common folk, and with them, ideas that could light a fire under society's collective backside. Let's break it down. The printing press, that clunky contraption of metal and dreams, didn't just make books cheaper, it made them dangerous. Cheaper books meant more readers, and more readers meant a public hungry for new ideas. This wasn't just about swapping out Latin tomes for German pamphlets. It was about democratizing dissent. If knowledge is power, then Gutenberg had just handed out the keys to the armory. First on the agenda, the explosion of literacy rates. Now, let's not get carried away. This wasn't an overnight transformation. By the early 16th century, literacy was still largely the domain of the urban elite. But the seeds were sown. As towns and cities grew, so did schools and universities, and the printed word became an educational lifeline. By 1500, there were about 250 European cities with printing presses, and they churned out over 20 million volumes. That's a whole lot of bedtime reading, even if most of it was still religious texts and Latin classics. But here's where it gets spicy. The real game changer was the pamphlet. Think of them as the medieval equivalent of a viral tweet, fast, cheap, and capable of causing a ruckus. These little booklets could be cranked out quickly and spread like wildfire, especially when they contained a juicy bit of controversy. Take Martin Luther, for instance. His 95 Theses, nailed to a church door in 1517, were a call to arms against the Catholic Church's practices. Within 2 weeks, they were printed and disseminated across Germany. Within 2 months, they'd crossed European borders. Luther's words were the kindling, but the printing press was the match. Speaking of Luther, here's where the Protestant Reformation and the press become a dynamic duo. The Reformation was as much about communication as it was about theology. Luther and his fellow reformers used the press like a megaphone, broadcasting their calls for religious reform across the continent. By the time the Catholic Church realized what was happening, the horse had bolted, taking half the barn with it. The press didn't just spread ideas, it legitimized them. If a pamphlet was printed, it carried the weight of authority, even if that authority was just a couple of guys with a printing press in a cellar. But hang on, it's not all sunshine and reform. The printing press was a double-edged sword. For every pamphlet calling for change, there was another spreading misinformation or inciting violence. The press was used to vilify enemies just as easily as it was to inspire allies. The same technology that empowered reformers also fueled witch hunts and pogroms. It was the wild west of information, and not everyone was riding into the sunset. And then there's the economic angle. The printing press didn't just revolutionize culture, it flipped the economic script. Suddenly, there was a whole new market for printed materials, from books to pamphlets to broadsheets. Printers became the tech entrepreneurs of their day, balancing the art of the press with the demands of commerce. Successful printers were part craftsman, part businessman, and part gambler. They had to anticipate trends, manage costs, and avoid printing content that could land them in hot water with the authorities. The ripple effects were felt far and wide. As books became more accessible, they spurred curiosity and innovation. Scientists, philosophers, and explorers all benefited from the rapid dissemination of knowledge. The printing press helped spread Copernicus's heliocentric model and Galileo's astronomical observations, setting the stage for the scientific revolution. It was like a giant game of intellectual ping-pong, with ideas bouncing across borders and cultures. But let's not pretend the press was a panacea for all of society's ills. While it democratized knowledge, it also democratized the dissemination of ignorance. The same press that printed Luther's Theses could just as easily print falsehoods. It was a tool, and like any tool, its impact depended on the hands that wielded it. The printing press could illuminate, but it could also obscure. Ultimately, Gutenberg's press was a catalyst, not a conclusion. It set in motion a series of events that would eventually lead to the Enlightenment, the Age of Reason, and beyond. Yet, the path was anything but straight. The press unleashed a torrent of ideas that would challenge authority, topple regimes, and reshape faith. It transformed the way people thought about the world and their place in it. But remember, revolution isn't a one-way street. For every stride forward, there was often a stumble backward. So, what have we learned from this whirlwind tour through history's printing revolution? Gutenberg's legacy isn't just about the books he printed. It's about the world his invention helped create, a world where ideas could spread faster than ever before, and where the pen truly became mightier than the sword. And as for the rest, well, that chapter is still being written, one printed page at a time. Stay tuned, because the story is far from over. And so, as the echoes of Gutenberg's printing press reverberate through history, let's take a moment to consider the man behind the machine. Johann Gutenberg, the genius who lit the fuse of the information explosion, didn't exactly ride off into a golden sunset. In fact, his later years were more like a Shakespearean drama, full of ambition, betrayal, and a touch of obscurity. It's tempting to envision Johann as a celebrated hero, basking in accolades, but reality served up something a bit more bittersweet. By the time Gutenberg shuffled off this mortal coil in 1468, he was living in relative obscurity in Mainz. Sure, he had a modest pension from the archbishop there, but this was hardly the victory lap one might expect for a man whose invention would eventually change the course of Western civilization. Think of it less like a ticker-tape parade and more like a quiet stroll through the park. Peaceful, yes, but lacking the fanfare one might hope for after revolutionizing the world. So why the low-key exit for such a high-impact figure? For starters, recognition in his lifetime was scant, and the world was only beginning to wake up to the true power of his creation. Gutenberg's name wasn't plastered across his printed works like a modern-day brand logo. That kind of celebrity status just wasn't a thing in the 15th century. The idea of mass-producing books was so revolutionary that people were still grappling with the implications. It's a bit like introducing the smartphone to someone still marveling at the wonders of the rotary dial. Moreover, Gutenberg's financial woes left him more as a footnote in the very history he helped create. The press he pioneered was quickly adopted and adapted by others, including his former partners-turned-rivals, Johann Fust and Peter Schurfer. They were the ones who reaped the immediate rewards, publishing more works and advancing the technology. Gutenberg, meanwhile, was left to watch his creation take flight without him, a bit like an inventor whose prototype gets swept up by a tech giant. Yet, despite the personal setbacks, Gutenberg's legacy is as enduring as a first edition of Harry Potter. His press was the original disruptor, the 15th century equivalent of the internet, and it paved the way for the modern world in ways he could scarcely have imagined. The press didn't just print books, it printed the future. It democratized knowledge, setting off a chain reaction that would lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, and the Enlightenment. Each of these movements was built on the foundation of accessible information, and for that, we owe Gutenberg a nod of gratitude. In the grand timeline of human achievement, Gutenberg's press stands out as one of history's greatest game-changers. Before the press, knowledge was hoarded, locked away like treasure in a dragon's lair. Afterward, it flowed more freely, seeping into every corner of society. The press was a great equalizer, leveling the playing field and allowing ideas to spread without the bottleneck of manual copying. It was the bridge from the medieval to the modern, from the cloistered scriptorium to the bustling city square. And let's not ignore the economic impact. The printing press was a catalyst for capitalism, creating a new industry and a new class of entrepreneurs. Printers became pivotal players in the marketplace of ideas, balancing art and commerce with the finesse of a tightrope walker. They had to be nimble, adapting to tastes and trends while avoiding the ire of those in power. The press didn't just change what people read, it changed how they lived, spurring trade, enhancing literacy, and fueling the engines of progress. Yet, despite the monumental shift Gutenberg's invention ushered in, his name didn't become synonymous with genius until centuries later. It wasn't until the 19th century that Gutenberg was posthumously knighted as the father of printing at the International Gutenberg Society's founding in 1901. In a way, Johann was like a rock star whose music only hit the charts long after he left the stage. His story reminds us that sometimes the seeds of greatness take time to germinate. In the end, Gutenberg's tale is a study in contrasts. A man whose vision was as clear as the ink on his pages, yet whose personal story was marked by shadows of debt and defeat. It's a reminder that innovation often comes at a personal cost, that the pioneers of progress are not always the ones who profit. But while Johann may not have enjoyed the fruits of his labor, the orchard he planted continues to bear fruit, feeding the minds of generations. So there you have it, the legacy of Johann Gutenberg, a man who took a gamble on an idea, and in doing so, set the world on a path it would never stray from. His press was more than a machine. It was a movement, an idea that transcended its humble origins to become a cornerstone of modernity. As we close this chapter on Gutenberg, let's remember that history is not just about dates and inventions. It's about the people who dared to dream, to disrupt, and to change the world one printed page at a time. If you've ever wondered who gave your high school philosophy teacher the authority to wear tweed jackets and talk in circles, look no further than ancient Greece. You might say these guys were the original overthinkers, but unlike most overthinkers today, their musings actually shaped the entire Western world. So, who were these cerebral heavyweights? Let's start with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, the tag-team trio of Greek philosophy. They were more than just toga-wearing thinkers. They were the intellectual rock stars of their time, albeit with fewer screaming fans and more scrolls of parchment. Socrates, for one, was a man who asked questions like a 4-year-old who just discovered the word why. Born around 470 BCE, he wandered the streets of Athens, questioning every assumption society held dear. And boy, did that make people uncomfortable. His method was simple. Ask people to define concepts like justice or virtue, then point out the flaws in their reasoning until their brains tied themselves into philosophical knots. In a world where thinking outside the amphora could get you into trouble, Socrates was the ultimate provocateur. He didn't write anything down, so if you're looking for a Socratic book club, you're out of luck. Everything we know about him comes from his student Plato. Speaking of Plato, this guy was the philosopher who put pen to papyrus. Born in 428 BCE, he was the student who took his teacher's ideas and ran with them, like a philosophical sprinter. Plato founded the Academy in Athens around 387 BCE, one of the earliest institutions of higher learning in the Western world, before it became trendy to charge exorbitant tuition fees. His works, like The Republic, dissected concepts of justice and governance, even proposing the idea of a philosopher king, a ruler who governed not through might, but through wisdom. It sounds charming, a wise ruler who reads books instead of launching wars. But here's the kicker. The ancient world was as likely to produce philosopher kings as a modern fast food joint is to serve a healthy salad. Plato himself admitted the idea was more ideal than practical. Enter Aristotle, Plato's star pupil, and a man who could turn any topic into a dissertation. Born in 384 BCE, he was the kind of guy who would throw a toga party and then spend the entire evening categorizing the different types of guests. Aristotle took Plato's abstract ideas and grounded them in reality. He wrote on everything from ethics to politics to metaphysics, and let's not forget his contributions to biology. Aristotle was, essentially, the Swiss Army knife of philosophers. His Nicomachean ethics explored virtues as habits, and his politics examined the role of the polis, or city-state, in human development. His influence was so pervasive that even centuries later, medieval scholars referred to him simply as the philosopher, as if there were no others worth mentioning. Now, let's not romanticize these men too much. Socrates may have been a genius at questioning assumptions, but he also had a penchant for annoying people to the point where they sentenced him to death by hemlock in 399 BCE. Yes, he chose death over exile, sticking to his principles like a philosopher should. But it's hard to ignore the fact that his stubbornness left his students reeling. Plato was no stranger to controversy either. His political ideas were sometimes seen as elitist, and his disdain for democracy was a direct critique of Athenian society. Aristotle, meanwhile, had some ideas that would make a modern ethicist cringe, like his views on natural slavery and women's roles, which were less progressive and more regressive than a chariot race in reverse. Despite their flaws, these thinkers laid the intellectual groundwork for Western philosophy. Their musings on ethics, politics, and metaphysics would echo through the ages, influencing everyone from Roman philosophers to Renaissance thinkers and beyond. Their ideas fueled debates that continue in classrooms and coffee shops to this day. So next time you hear someone pontificating over a latte about the nature of reality, you can thank or blame these ancient Greeks for starting the conversation. Yet, it's worth noting the practical realities these philosophers faced. The Greek city-states, Athens in particular, were thriving centers of trade and culture, yet they were also rife with political turmoil and social inequality. The very environment that fostered such groundbreaking thought was, paradoxically, a crucible of conflict. Socrates survived the Peloponnesian War, a 27-year slog between Athens and Sparta that concluded in 404 BCE, leaving Athens battered and bruised. Plato witnessed the oligarchic coup of the 30 tyrants in 404 BCE, which briefly toppled Athenian democracy. Aristotle's life unfolded during the rise of Macedon under Philip Roman II and his famous son, Alexander the Great. In a society where democracy was a brand-new experiment and political power shifted like sand in an hourglass, the philosopher's role was both revered and reviled. These men didn't just ponder abstract concepts. They engaged with the pressing issues of their time, challenging norms and questioning the very fabric of society. It was a risky endeavor, but one that shaped the intellectual landscape for generations. So, as we wrap up our introduction to these philosophical giants, remember that their story is not just about lofty ideas or academic accolades. It's a story of human beings grappling with the complexities of their world, armed with nothing but the power of their minds. They may not have had all the answers, and they certainly didn't live as saintly sages. But in their relentless pursuit of truth, they left us with a legacy that continues to challenge and inspire. As we pivot from philosophical musings to a more tangible form of genius, let's step into the world of Greek art and architecture. And what better place to start than the Parthenon? This marble marvel is the crown jewel of Athens, a city that, despite its reputation for intellectual pursuits, knew how to flex its artistic muscles. But before we dive headlong into the grandeur, let's set the scene. Athens in the 5th century BCE wasn't just a hub of lofty ideas. It was also a hotbed of political ambition and economic strategy. The Parthenon, completed in 438 BCE, stands as a testament not only to artistic genius, but also to the economic might of Athens at its peak. It was part of a grand rebuilding program initiated by Pericles, the charismatic statesman who knew how to work a crowd and a budget. Following the Persian Wars, Athens was flush with cash from the Delian League, a coalition of city-states that was originally a mutual defense pact, but ended up being more like Athens' personal piggy bank. They moved the League's treasury to Athens in 454 BCE under the guise of safekeeping. But let's be real, it was about as safe as a cookie jar in a house full of kids. The Parthenon itself was a financial juggernaut. The cost of construction was a staggering 469 silver talents, roughly equivalent to $7 million today. If you're wondering how much marble that buys, the answer is a lot. The structure was built using approximately 400 stones, each meticulously carved and fitted without the help of modern machinery. The columns, with their subtle intarses, a slight curve to counteract optical illusion, were crafted to perfection, a feat that would make even the most seasoned modern architect sweat. But let's not romanticize it too much. The labor behind this masterpiece was less about divine inspiration and more about sheer human effort. Imagine hundreds of workers, from skilled stonemasons to lowly laborers, toiling under the scorching Athenian sun. It was a job that required both brute strength and delicate artistry, a combination as rare then as it is now. And while we're on the topic of myth-busting, let's dispel the notion that these workers were all free men, happily chiseling away for the glory of Athens. Many were slaves or medics, non-citizen residents, who didn't exactly have a say in their career paths. Now, why did Athens embark on such an extravagant project? It wasn't just about artistic expression, it was a political statement. The Parthenon was built to honor Athena, the city's patron goddess, but it was also a declaration of power. In a world where city-states jostled for dominance, Athens wanted to shout from its marble rooftops that it was the unrivaled leader of the Greek world. It was a bit like hosting the Olympics and winning all the medals while you're at it. And let's not overlook the Parthenon's interior, which was as opulent as its exterior. Inside stood a colossal statue of Athena, crafted by Phidias, the Michelangelo of his day. This statue wasn't just a piece of art, it was a political tool. Made of gold and ivory, it showcased Athens' wealth and artistic prowess. The gold alone weighed around 140 kilograms, a clear message to any would-be aggressors that Athens was not to be trifled with. But here's the kicker. The Parthenon, and much of Athens' art, was funded by the very allies it was meant to protect. The funds from the Delian League were supposed to be used for defense, but Pericles funneled them into his ambitious building program. This financial sleight of hand didn't win him any friends, and tensions with other city-states simmered beneath the surface. Yet, in the grand narrative of history, the Parthenon stands as a symbol of Athenian democracy and cultural achievement, a little ironic, given its less-than-transparent funding. The political undercurrents didn't stop there. The construction of the Parthenon served as a tool for unifying Athens. It was a project that employed thousands, providing jobs and stimulating the economy, a sort of ancient New Deal. Pericles understood that a busy populace was a happy populace, or at least a distracted one. By investing in monumental architecture, he was not just beautifying the city, he was buying social stability. And yet, the story of Athenian art and architecture isn't just about grand projects and political machinations. The legacy of Greek art is one of innovation and influence. The Greeks were the first to develop the concept of contrapposto, a stance where a figure appears more dynamic and relaxed, as if caught in motion. This technique revolutionized sculpture and would resonate through the ages, inspiring countless artists from the Renaissance to Rodin. Yet, despite the advancements and the undeniable allure of Greek art, let's not forget the economic reality. The resources required to sustain such artistic endeavors were immense. Marble had to be quarried from Mount Pentelicus, transported over 16 kilometers to Athens, and carved with painstaking precision. The logistics alone were a masterpiece of planning and execution. It was a costly affair, and not everyone was on board with this artistic splurge. Critics accused Pericles of squandering the city's wealth on vanity projects, and it's easy to see why. In a world where resources were finite and military threats were ever present, spending a fortune on marble statues seemed to some a bit like buying a designer wardrobe while your house is on fire. So, as we gaze upon the ruins of these ancient structures, it's tempting to get swept up in their beauty and grandeur. But it's crucial to remember the grit and grind behind the gleaming facades. The art and architecture of ancient Greece were not just expressions of creative genius. They were products of their time, shaped by the economic and political forces that defined an era. They were monuments to ambition, both artistic and political, and they continue to captivate us precisely because they embody the contradictions and complexities of the human spirit. As we wrap up our exploration of Greek art and architecture, let's keep in mind that these achievements, much like the philosophers who debated in their shadows, were born from a society as vibrant and volatile as the masterpieces it produced. The Parthenon may have been a triumph of design, but it was also a testament to the power struggles and economic realities of its time. A reminder that history's most beautiful creations often have the messiest backstories. Now, while the Parthenon glistened under the Athenian sun, casting long shadows over the city, another kind of brilliance was at play in the theatres of ancient Greece. Here, the spotlight wasn't on marble columns or gold-leafed statues, but on the human condition itself. Enter the dramatic world of Greek theatre, where playwrights like Sophocles and Aristophanes turned the stage into a crucible for social commentary and entertainment. If you thought modern TV shows like The Daily Show or Saturday Night Live had a monopoly on mixing humor with critique, think again. These ancient dramatists were the OGs of satirical storytelling. The Athenian stage was as much a social barometer as it was a form of entertainment, and let's not sugarcoat it. Greek drama was born out of a heady mix of cultural pride, political tension, and religious devotion. This wasn't just about putting on a good show. It was about exploring the complexities of human nature and the society it struggled within. The theatrical festival of Dionysia, held annually in Athens, was a cultural juggernaut that made the Super Bowl look like a local bake sale. Citizens packed into the theatre of Dionysus, grand open-air amphitheatre that could hold up to 17,000 spectators, all eager to see what the playwrights had cooked up. Let's dive into Sophocles, a playwright who could make a family drama feel as gripping as a thriller. Born in 497 BCE, Sophocles was Athens' golden boy, penning over 120 plays in his lifetime. A mere 7 have survived, but those are enough to cement his legacy. His most famous work, Oedipus Rex, isn't just a play, it's a masterclass in irony and fate. The story of a man doomed to kill his father and marry his mother might not scream crowd pleaser today, but back then it was the talk of the polis. Sophocles used the tragedy to probe the limits of human wisdom and the cruelty of destiny, themes that resonated across a city grappling with its own political and social upheavals. Antigone, another of his masterpieces, tackled the clash between individual conscience and state law, a topic as fresh in 441 BCE as it is now. Sophocles dared to question authority, poking at the idea that maybe, just maybe, the laws of man shouldn't always trump the laws of conscience. His characters were as flawed and complex as any modern anti-hero, making his plays timeless explorations of morality and power. But Sophocles wasn't performing in a vacuum. His works were shaped by the economic and political currents of his time. The Peloponnesian War, a grueling conflict between Athens and Sparta, loomed large, influencing the themes of his plays. War and peace, hubris and humility. Sophocles wove these elements into narratives that mirrored the anxieties of an Athens that was both a cultural titan and a city on the brink. Now, while Sophocles excelled in tragedy, Aristophanes was the king of comedy, wielding humor like a surgeon's scalpel. Born around 446 BCE, Aristophanes was the satirist who could take down political figures with a wink and a nudge, making him the John Stewart of his day. His plays were anything but gentle, lampooning politicians, philosophers, and even fellow playwrights with biting wit. Lysistrata, one of his most enduring works, tells the tale of women from warring city-states banding together to end the Peloponnesian War by denying their husbands any bedroom activities until peace is declared. Now, if that's not a plot ripped from the pages of How to Influence Men and Start a Revolution, I don't know what is. Aristophanes' work wasn't just about getting laughs. It was about poking the Athenian establishment in the eye. In The Clouds, he targeted none other than Socrates, depicting him as a bumbling sophist lost in his own pedantic musings. It was as much a critique of intellectual pretension as it was a commentary on societal change. Aristophanes dared to mark the very foundations of Athenian society, a move as risky as it was revolutionary. But here's the kicker. While Aristophanes' comedies had audiences rolling in the aisles, they were also vehicles for serious critique. The political landscape of Athens was as turbulent as a soap opera, and Aristophanes wasn't shy about airing the city's dirty laundry. His plays tackled everything from the futility of war to the absurdity of political leaders, topics that remain eerily relevant today. And let's not forget the economic undercurrents that shaped these theatrical spectacles. Tickets to these plays weren't just handed out willy-nilly. Attending the Dionysia was a civic duty, subsidized by the state, to ensure that even the poorest citizens could partake in the cultural feast. The festival was a massive economic undertaking, with playwrights vying for the prestigious prize of Best Play, a win that could elevate a dramatist's career and bring significant prestige. Yet, despite the glamour and glory, the theatre was also a mirror reflecting the inequalities and tensions of Athenian society. Women, for instance, were notably absent from the audience, or if they attended, it was with little fanfare. The very plays that sometimes championed women's voices were performed in a society that silenced them. It's a contradiction as sharp as any of Aristophanes' jabs. So, as we revel in the brilliance of Greek drama, it's crucial to acknowledge the dualities that defined it. The theatre was both a stage for entertainment and a platform for protest, a place where the highs and lows of human experience were laid bare. Playwrights like Sophocles and Aristophanes didn't just write plays. They crafted cultural commentaries that continue to challenge, entertain, and provoke thought. As we leave the bustling amphitheaters of Athens, let's not forget that these stories and performances were more than mere diversions. They were reflections of a society wrestling with its identity, a narrative as compelling today as it was 2.5 millennia ago. And while the marble facades of Athens have crumbled, the legacies of these playwrights endure, reminding us that the stage, much like history itself, is a space where the human experience is both celebrated and scrutinized. Just as the curtains fall on the Athenian stage, we pivot from the grand amphitheaters to the quieter, often overlooked corridors of history where Greek women subtly etched their legacies. Now, if you think the ancient world was an exclusive boys' club, think again. Sure, the spotlight often shone on the tunic-wearing philosophers and dramatists, but lurking in the shadows were women whose contributions were as profound as they were unsung. Enter Sappho, the poetess from the island of Lesbos, who wrote verses that could melt the heart of even the most stoic Spartan. Born around 630 BCE, Sappho was the Beyoncé of her time, minus the backup dancers and pyrotechnics. Her poetry, though only fragments survive today, was revolutionary, focusing not on the grandiose tales of gods and heroes, but on personal emotions and intimate moments. She wrote of love, longing, and the intricate dance of human relationships, offering a voice that was both uniquely feminine and universally resonant. Now, before you picture Sappho as some reclusive poet scribbling by candlelight, let's set the record straight. She was a part of a vibrant intellectual community on Lesbos, a hub where art and culture flourished. Her work was so revered that Plato allegedly called her the 10th muse, which, let's be honest, is about as high a compliment as one could get in the ancient world. But here's the rub. Despite her acclaim, Sappho's life wasn't all lyrical bliss. She lived in a society where women's voices were often drowned out by the thunderous echoes of male-dominated discourse. Women were expected to focus on domesticity, not dabble in the poetic arts. Yet, Sappho managed to carve out a space for herself, using her poetry to challenge societal norms and express desires that were considered taboo. It's a bit like sneaking into an exclusive club and finding your own spotlight on stage. Speaking of breaking barriers, let's talk about Hypatia of Alexandria, a philosopher and mathematician whose intellect was as sharp as the stylus she wielded. Born in the late 4th century CE, Hypatia was a towering figure in a world where women were more often seen as muses than mathematicians. She was the head of the Neoplatonist school in Alexandria, a city that was basically the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, a melting pot of ideas, innovation, and, unfortunately, religious strife. Hypatia's work in mathematics and philosophy was groundbreaking. She wrote commentaries on Diophantus's Arithmetica and Ptolemy's Almagest, making complex concepts accessible to her students. Imagine a time when calculators were as mythical as unicorns, and you'll appreciate the mental gymnastics required to solve equations by candlelight. Hypatia wasn't just about crunching numbers, though. She was a philosopher who engaged with the pressing issues of her time, from the nature of the universe to the place of humanity within it. Yet, despite her brilliance, Hypatia's life was a tragic testament to the volatile intersection of politics, religion, and gender. In 415 C, she was brutally murdered by a Christian mob, a victim of the very societal tensions she sought to navigate. Her death marked the beginning of the end for the intellectual haven of Alexandria, a sobering reminder of how fragile the pursuit of knowledge can be when caught in the crossfire of ideological conflict. It's easy to romanticize figures like Sappho and Hypatia as lone geniuses defying the odds, but let's not gloss over the harsh realities they faced. Women in ancient Greece were often confined to the domestic sphere, their roles dictated by a society that valued them more for their ability to bear children than for their intellectual contributions. Yet, these women found ways to express themselves, often through the arts, in a world that was less than welcoming. Take, for example, the case of female artists and musicians, who were often relegated to the fringes of society. While men strutted on the public stage, women performed in private settings, their talents appreciated but not formally recognized. The hetairai, or courtesans, were some of the few women who could engage in intellectual and artistic pursuits, albeit at the cost of societal scorn. These women were often educated and skilled in music and conversation, playing a role that was part artist, part entertainer, and part social commentator. It's a narrative as old as time, women finding ways to express their creativity and intellect in a world that prefers them silent. Yet, despite the odds, these women's contributions were significant, shaping cultural and intellectual landscapes in ways that are just beginning to be acknowledged. Now, let's not get overly sentimental. Yes, these women were trailblazers, but they were also products of their times, navigating societal constraints with a mix of ingenuity and resilience. Their stories remind us that history is not just a chronicle of kings and conquerors, but a tapestry woven with the threads of countless, often overlooked lives. As we continue to unravel the complexities of ancient Greece, it's crucial to recognize the layers beneath the marble facades and philosophical treatises. The stories of Sappho, Hypatia, and countless other women are reminders that history is as much about those who dared to defy conventions as it is about those who set them. So, the next time you hear someone waxing lyrical about the glory days of ancient Greece, remember the women who, despite everything, found ways to leave their mark on history's scroll. They may not have had the spotlight they deserved, but their legacies continue to illuminate the past with a brilliance that refuses to be dimmed. And so we stand at the crossroads of ancient brilliance and modern marvels, pondering the legacy of a civilization that seemed to have its fingerprints all over the Western world's cultural and intellectual DNA. Ancient Greece, with its philosophers, poets, and architects, laid the groundwork for what we often consider the hallmarks of civilized society. But let's not kid ourselves. This wasn't some utopia of toga-clad geniuses holding enlightened TED talks under the Athenian sun. No, it was a chaotic, ambitious, and often brutal world where ideas were born out of necessity as much as inspiration. Take democracy, for instance. The Greeks didn't invent it to provide fodder for political science textbooks or to give future generations something to debate over dinner parties. Nope, it was a practical solution to the very real problem of how to govern a city-state teeming with rival factions and restless citizens. But before you get misty-eyed imagining Socrates casting a vote, he couldn't, by the way. He was too busy irking the powers that be. Remember that this democratic experiment was more exclusive club than everyone's invited. Women, slaves, and non-citizens were as welcome in the political arena as a bull in a china shop. Still, the concept of democracy planted seeds that would eventually grow into the representative systems we know today, albeit with a lot of pruning along the way. The influence of Greek thought didn't stop at political systems. Fast forward a couple of millennia, and you'll find their intellectual offspring lurking in the halls of academia. Take philosophy, that eternal quest to answer life's unanswerable questions. Thanks, Plato. From Roman Stoics to Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke and René Descartes, the echoes of Greek philosophy have reverberated across time. Aristotle's logic became the backbone of medieval scholarship, and his works were resurrected during the Renaissance like a literary Lazarus. It's a bit like finding out your family recipe for lasagna has been the hit of every potluck for the past 2,000 years, both flattering and a little overwhelming. And then there's the art. Greek sculpture and architecture have been mimicked and marveled at for centuries. The Parthenon's proportions inspired the likes of Renaissance masters and modern architects, proving that good design never goes out of style. Those Doric and Ionic columns have been holding up not just buildings, but artistic standards, from the neoclassical revival to your local courthouse. It's as if ancient Greece sent out a particularly stylish chain letter, and everyone was too afraid not to pass it on. But let's not gloss over the less savory aspects of this legacy. For all their genius, the Greeks were not always the egalitarian idealists we sometimes imagine. Their society was built on a bedrock of inequality, where the leisure of the few was supported by the labor of many. Slavery was an accepted institution, and for all the talk of democratic ideals, Greek women were often relegated to the sidelines. It's a stark reminder that even the most enlightened societies have their shadows. Yet, in the grand tapestry of history, Greek contributions have been woven into the very fabric of modern civilization. The Olympics, once a festival of athletic prowess and political posturing, now bring the world together in a quadrennial display of unity and competition. And while the original games had their share of scandals, athletes bribing officials or sabotaging rivals, some things, it seems, never change. Even in the world of literature and drama, the Greeks left an indelible mark. The themes explored by Sophocles and Aristophanes, power, hubris, the human condition, continue to resonate on stages and screens around the globe. It's as if every time you watch a tragic hero self-destruct or a satirical comedy skewers the powers that be, you're seeing the ghost of Athens' past giving a knowing nod. So, what can we take away from this whirlwind tour of ancient Greece? Perhaps it's the realization that history, much like the human condition, is a tangled web of contradictions. The Greeks gave us both the ideals we strive for and the cautionary tales we learn from. They were visionaries and realists, idealists and pragmatists. Their legacy is a testament to the complexity of human nature, brilliant and flawed, ambitious and fallible. As we close the book on this chapter of history, let's remember that the story of ancient Greece is not just a litany of achievements, but also a mirror reflecting the best and worst of what humanity can be. It's a reminder that while the past may be set in stone, its lessons continue to evolve, challenging us to build on the foundations they laid. So the next time you sip your coffee while pondering democracy or admire a beautifully proportioned building, give a nod to the Greeks. They might not have all the answers, but they sure knew how to ask the right questions. In the grand carousel of history, where empires rise and fall like so many soap bubbles in a washing machine, the Hittites made quite the splash. Perched in what we now call Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, for those of us who didn't sleep through geography class, these folks were the underdogs of the late Bronze Age, around 1600 BCE. Before they decided to make life interesting, Hittite might have sounded like a sneeze to the average Mesopotamian. But soon enough, these Anatolian upstarts were on everyone's radar, thanks to one particularly game-changing trick up their sleeves: iron. Now, let's set the scene. We're in a time when copper, bronze, and tin are the go-to materials. Tin, like the hipster of the metal world, was rare and expensive, much like avocado toast today. Enter the Hittites. These savvy metallurgists figured out that if you heat iron ore and mix it with just the right cocktail of carbon, you get a material that's not only stronger than bronze, but also more abundant. This was the equivalent of discovering the Wi-Fi password at a party. Suddenly, everyone wants to be your friend, or at least your frenetic foe. Iron wasn't just a shiny new toy. It was a strategic advantage. Weapons made from this durable metal meant the Hittites could arm their warriors with swords that didn't snap like twigs and chariots that didn't fall apart mid-battle. This transformation didn't happen overnight, though. It was more of a slow burn, the kind of dramatic build-up that would make any Netflix series jealous. By 1400 BCE, they had solidified their position as a major power player, and their neighbors, the Egyptians and Babylonians, were not sending congratulatory fruit baskets. Speaking of neighbors, let's gossip about the Egyptians for a second. The pharaohs, with their pyramids and penchant for eyeliner, were the top dogs of the ancient world. They had mastered the Nile, built monuments that would last millennia, and generally acted like they ran the place. But even they were getting a bit twitchy about the Hittites' rise, especially as iron weapons started clinking on the battlefield. The Egyptians were still using their trusty bronze, which suddenly seemed about as effective as a chocolate teapot. Then there were the Babylonians, the ancient equivalent of the kid with all the latest gadgets but a really messy room. They'd been around for ages, building cities like Babylon with its famous ziggurat, a word that's just as fun to say as it is to imagine. They had a complex society, advanced mathematics, base 60 system, and one of the first written legal codes. But when it came to iron, they were lagging behind, much to the Hittites' delight. So why did iron matter so much? Well, consider this. The difference between bronze and iron is like the leap from dial-up internet to fiber optics. Bronze was good for the time, but iron was a revolution. It allowed for stronger tools and weapons, which in turn meant more efficient agriculture, better warfare capabilities, and ultimately a more robust empire. The Hittites were not just blacksmiths. They were the Silicon Valley of the ancient world, pushing boundaries and reaping the rewards. But let's not romanticize them too much. The Hittites were as prone to the pitfalls of power as any other civilization. Their kings, like Hattusili and his descendants, played the political game with the best of them. Alliances were formed and broken faster than Hollywood marriages. Hattusa, their capital, became a bustling hive of activity, a city that could rival any of its peers in terms of grandeur and chaos. Archaeological digs reveal a city fortified with massive walls, a testament to both their engineering prowess and paranoia. In the grand chess match of history, the Hittites were strategic, calculating players. They knew how to pick their battles, literally and figuratively. Yet, for all their cunning, they couldn't escape the inevitable ebb and flow of empires. Around 1200 BCE, the Bronze Age collapse, a mysterious and catastrophic event, swept across the region, bringing down the Hittites along with other mighty civilizations. It was history's way of saying, don't get too comfortable. In hindsight, the Hittites' tale is one of ambition, innovation, and inevitable decline. They remind us that even the mightiest can fall, often as swiftly as they rise. But while they held power, they made sure everyone knew it. wielding iron like a conductor with a baton, orchestrating their symphony of conquest and control. And that, dear listeners, is why they mattered. The Hittites were the rock stars of their era, headlining a show that no one would soon forget. While the Hittites were busy strutting their iron stuff like the rock stars of the ancient world, it's time we zoom in on one of their headline acts, Sepululima I. If there was a Hittite Hall of Fame, this guy would have his own wing. Reigning around 1350 BCE, he wasn't just content with running Anatolia. No, Sepululima had his sights set on expansion, and boy did he know how to play the political game like a seasoned chess master. Imagine him as the puppet master of the ancient Near East, pulling strings with the deftness of a Vegas illusionist. Sepululima's reign was all about turning the Hittite kingdom into a regional powerhouse. And how did he do this? Well, he had a knack for turning potential enemies into allies, or at least into vassal states, which were basically like the satellite offices of his empire. Picture these vassal states as the ancient equivalent of franchising. Instead of burgers and fries, they dealt in loyalty and military support. The Hittites would swoop in, offer protection, and in return, these states would swear fealty and, crucially, taxes and troops. It was a win-win, unless you were the vassal state, in which case it was more of a win-maybe situation. Now, Sepululima wasn't the kind of leader who relied solely on the carrot approach. He was fully prepared to whip out the stick when needed. His military campaigns stretched across the region, from Syria to the fringes of Mesopotamia, leaving a trail of subjugated territories in his wake. One of his most notable conquests was the kingdom of Mitanni, a regional heavyweight that Sepululima dismantled with surgical precision. By the time Sepululima was done, Mitanni was less of a kingdom and more of a historical footnote. Talk about a hostile takeover. But the real coup de grace in his political gymnastics was his handling of Egypt. Now, the Egyptians were not exactly pushovers. We're talking about a civilization that built pyramids with the same nonchalance that we build skyscrapers. Yet, Sepululima found a way to stick it to the pharaohs when he got the call to arms from an unlikely source, the widow of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun herself. In a twist that could have been ripped straight from a soap opera, she asked Sepululima to send one of his sons to marry her and become pharaoh. Imagine that, an Egyptian queen dialing up the Hittites for help. Spoiler alert, things didn't quite go as planned. The son never made it to Egypt, allegedly ambushed and killed en route. So much for a diplomatic marriage. Still, this episode showed just how far Sepululima's influence reached, even if it didn't end with a Hittite sitting on the Egyptian throne. It was a testament to his savvy that he was even in the running to influence Egyptian affairs. In the end, though, it was the Hittites' strategic use of vassal states that solidified their expansion. By creating a network of subordinate kingdoms, they maintained a firm grip on their empire without overextending themselves. It was the ancient equivalent of outsourcing, allowing the central Hittite power to focus on the big picture while their regional allies handled local affairs. Fast forward to 1274 BCE, and let's talk about one of the most epic battles of the ancient world, the Battle of Kadesh. This clash between the Egyptians and the Hittites was the Super Bowl of its day, complete with all the drama and excitement. On one side, you had the Egyptians, led by the young and ambitious pharaoh Ramesses II. On the other, the Hittites, under the command of Muwatalli II, a king whose name sounds like a sneeze, but whose military prowess was nothing to sniff at. The stakes were high. Control of Kadesh, a strategically critical city in what is now Syria, was like holding the keys to a very lucrative trade route. Both empires wanted it, and neither was willing to back down. The ensuing battle was a chariot-racing, spear-throwing, dust-cloud-raising spectacle that saw tens of thousands of troops clashing on the open plains. And here's where it gets intriguing. Neither side could claim a decisive victory. It was a classic stalemate, yet both leaders went home claiming they'd won. Ramesses II, ever the showman, made sure his version of events was carved into stone, literally. Inscriptions across Egypt hailed his bravery and victory at Kadesh, turning what was essentially a draw into a PR triumph. Muwatalli II, on the other hand, was less concerned with spin and more focused on maintaining control over the region. The Egyptians might have made the bigger splash with their propaganda, but the Hittites held onto Kadesh, which was the real prize. The Battle of Kadesh, is a perfect example of how history can be as much about perception as it is about facts. In the absence of social media, it was the stone carvings and epic poems that shaped public opinion. Both empires used the battle to bolster their reputations, even if the reality was far less glamorous than the tales they spun. It's a reminder that humans have always been adept at molding narratives to suit their needs, whether through hieroglyphs or hashtags. As we wrap up this chapter of Hittite history, it's clear their story is far from a simple saga of rise and fall. It's a tale of cunning political maneuvering, strategic alliances, and more than a little luck. They were the masters of their own fate, until the tides of history inevitably turned against them. But for now, let's leave the Hittites basking in their hard-earned glory, with more chapters of intrigue and conquest still to come. And now, let's turn the page to one of the juiciest chapters in the Hittite handbook, their economic engine. If you thought the Hittites were just a bunch of iron-wielding warriors, think again. Their empire wasn't just fueled by muscle and metal. It was greased by trade routes and economic savvy that would make even modern tycoons nod in approval. They didn't just corner the market on iron. They had a veritable monopoly, and they knew how to leverage it like a Wall Street shark with insider info. So, how did the Hittites convert iron into an empire-building material? First off, location, location, location. Nestled in Anatolia, they were sitting on a geological gold mine. Well, iron mine, to be precise. The Hittites had access to the high-quality ore deposits of the region, which they smelted with a signature blend of carbon. By about 1500 BCE, they'd mastered the technique of turning raw iron into tools and weapons that could withstand the rigors of battle and the wear and tear of time. This was an industrial revolution long before anyone thought to put steam and engine in the same sentence. But their economic prowess didn't stop at metal. The Hittites were also masters of the ancient trade game. Their empire sat at the crossroads of major trade routes, strategically bridging the east and west. Imagine the Silk Road's older, rougher sibling, complete with potholes and bandits. The Hittites capitalized on this prime real estate by taxing the goods that moved through their lands, which included everything from luxury textiles to grains and spices. In essence, they were rolling in the toll money, and that revenue was the backbone of their economic might. Yet, managing an empire with such sprawling trade networks wasn't all wine and roses, or in their case, barley and olive oil. Picture trying to run a multinational corporation with no email, no Zoom, and roads that were more goat trail than highway. It was a logistical nightmare. The Hittites had to maintain a system of roads and relay stations that allowed messages and taxes to flow back to the capital. It was like trying to run FedEx with carrier pigeons, but somehow they made it work. They set up way stations complete with provisions and fresh horses, creating a kind of ancient pony express. And speaking of their capital, Hadusa, it was a bustling metropolis that acted as the nerve center of the Hittite world. But it wasn't just a hub of commerce. It was also the seat of power, packed with bureaucrats who made sure the empire kept ticking along. Now, if you've ever had the pleasure of navigating a modern DMV, you might think you know bureaucratic red tape, but the Hittites' administrative system was something else entirely. Their legal codes were extensive, covering everything from property rights to the price of a donkey. They even had laws about how to treat runaway slaves and regulations for brewing beer. Imagine that, a civilization with a legal framework for happy hour. The Hittites' legal codes were inscribed on clay tablets, and these weren't just any tablets. We're talking about hefty, back-breaking chunks of clay that would make any archaeologist's eyes light up with the thrill of discovery. These tablets were stored in royal archives, the ancient equivalent of a government filing cabinet. And oh, the scandals they contained. Imagine a repository of every piece of gossip, every power move, every treaty, and every betrayal, all baked into clay. It was like the WikiLeaks of the ancient world, minus the internet and the international intrigue. The archives reveal a civilization that was as concerned with domestic squabbles as it was with foreign conquests. They show us kings penning letters to vassals, demanding tributes or threatening repercussions. They archive treaties with neighboring states, penned in cuneiform, often with lofty promises and veiled threats. These were the tangible remnants of the Hittites' diplomatic ballet, a dance that required the agility of a cat burglar and the patience of a saint. The Hittite archives also give us a glimpse into their religion and daily life. They had a pantheon of gods that would make any polytheist proud, each deity responsible for a different aspect of life. The Hittites were devout, holding festivals and making offerings to ensure their favor. Their rituals were meticulously recorded on these clay slabs, offering future generations a window into their soul. It's a reminder that, for all their iron and might, the Hittites were deeply spiritual, seeking divine guidance as much as they sought military victory. But let's not get too misty-eyed over their religious devotion. The Hittites were pragmatic, using religion as much to consolidate power as to commune with the divine. Their kings were not just rulers, they were high priests, linking the earthly and the divine in a neat little package that justified their rule. This divine mandate was yet another tool in their imperial toolkit, one that kept subjects in line and rivals at bay. As we peel back the layers of Hittite society, it becomes clear that their empire was as complex as it was formidable. They were not just conquerors, but administrators, diplomats, traders, and theologians. Their iron monopoly and trade networks were the arteries of an empire that pulsed with ambition and innovation. But while their economic engine was impressive, it required constant maintenance, a fact that would eventually contribute to their downfall. Yet for now, let's leave them at the height of their power, with the road ahead still unfolding in the chapters to come. As the Hittites basked in their iron-wielding glory and economic prowess, let's pivot to the cultural kaleidoscope that made their empire more than just a military juggernaut. For all their swords and trade routes, the Hittites also spun a vibrant tapestry of gods, art, and language that would leave even the most seasoned historians scratching their heads in wonder. First up, the Hittite pantheon, a divine soap opera if ever there was one. Picture this, a celestial family reunion where every god has an ego bigger than a chariot. The Hittites worshipped a dizzying array of deities, each with their own quirks and responsibilities. Teshub, the storm god, was the head honcho, wielding thunderbolts like a mythological Zeus. His wife, Hebat, was the mother goddess, overseeing fertility and motherhood, ensuring the Hittite population didn't dwindle due to too many wars. Then there was Arena, the sun goddess, lighting up the sky and Hittite hearts. These divine dramas were as packed with intrigue as any binge-worthy TV series, complete with power struggles and alliances. But the gods were more than just divine characters in a celestial play. They were integral to the Hittites' worldview, with each god representing a force of nature or aspect of life. The Hittites were nothing if not pragmatic about their worship. They saw the gods not as distant figures on a cloud, but as active participants in their daily grind. Festivals were held to appease these divine beings with offerings and rituals that would make any event planner proud. The Hittites didn't just pray, they negotiated with their gods, using religion as a tool to maintain social order and justify royal authority. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of their spiritual life, the role of the king as both ruler and high priest. Hittite kings were seen as intermediaries between the gods and the people, a nifty way to consolidate power if you ask me. When the king spoke, it was as if the heavens themselves were giving a thumbs up or down. This divine endorsement was crucial, especially when dealing with rebellious vassals or restless subjects. It was political theater at its finest, where religion and governance were as intertwined as the roots of an ancient oak. Now, onto the art and language, where the Hittites really let their creative juices flow. Their art wasn't just about pretty pictures, it was a visual language that spoke volumes. They carved their tales of conquest and divine favor onto stone reliefs, leaving a legacy that modern archaeologists have been puzzling over like a never-ending Sudoku. These artworks were not just decorative but functional, serving as propaganda tools that broadcast the might and piety of the Hittite kings. But the real linguistic treasure trove lies in the Hittite cuneiform tablets, the ancient version of a hard drive. Written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the time, these tablets were clay-bound epistles that chronicled everything from trade agreements to marriage proposals. Imagine the clay tablets as the Twitter of their day, with each wedge-shaped impression a tweet about taxes, treaties, or the latest gossip from the royal court. The deciphering of these tablets was no small feat, akin to cracking a code without a Rosetta Stone, but it revealed a civilization as complex as any modern nation-state. Speaking of language, let's not forget the Hittite hieroglyphs, a pictorial script that was as enigmatic as it was beautiful. Unlike the cuneiform, which was all about business, these hieroglyphs added a layer of mystique to Hittite communication. They adorned monumental inscriptions and official decrees, offering insights into the Hittites' self-perception and aspirations. Deciphering these hieroglyphs has been a Herculean task, with archaeologists piecing together meanings like detectives solving a cold case. And just when you think you've got them figured out, along come the myths, those tantalizing snippets of pseudo-history that make the Hittites seem like mystical wizards from a bygone era. Legends suggest they possessed arcane powers and secret knowledge, but let's dial that down a notch. The reality is less about magic and more about metallurgy. Their so-called mystical powers were largely the result of their mastery over iron and their clever use of religious symbolism. They weren't casting spells, they were casting metal. Yet the allure of these myths is undeniable. They paint the Hittites as larger-than-life figures, striding through history with a god-like aura. The truth, as always, is more down-to-earth. The Hittites were innovators, administrators, and yes, occasionally ruthless conquerors. They didn't need magic to build an empire. They had strategy, resources, and a keen understanding of human nature. It's a classic case of reality trumping legend. But oh, how we love the legends. In peeling back the layers of Hittite history, what emerges is a civilization that was as multifaceted as it was formidable. They were not just warriors, but artists, theologians, and linguists. Their gods were as much a part of their identity as their swords and trade routes, and their art and language continue to intrigue and baffle us. It's a rich tapestry, woven with threads of ambition, faith, and a touch of the enigmatic. As we continue to explore the Hittites, it's clear that their legacy is more than just the sum of their conquests. It's a story of a people who created a complex society that thrived on innovation and adaptability. They were a civilization that, while ultimately swept away by the tides of history, left an indelible mark on the ancient world. And as we delve deeper into their story, we find that the Hittites were not just a footnote in history books. They were a vibrant chapter, full of intrigue and lessons that still resonate today. With the Hittites' cultural and religious life laid bare, let's keep the momentum rolling as we dig deeper into their world. There's still plenty more to uncover about this enigmatic empire, from their societal structures to the eventual unraveling of their dominion. Stay tuned as we venture further into the annals of Hittite history, peeling back the layers of time one fascinating fact at a time. As we venture further into the annals of Hittite history, the decline of this once formidable empire looms like an ancient cliffhanger. Around 1200 BCE, the Hittites faced a storm of troubles. Think of it as a historical mashup of Game of Thrones meets Survivor, where everyone's scheming, but you can't vote anyone off the island. First, let's talk about the internal strife. The Hittite Empire was like a Jenga tower, tall and impressive but a bit wobbly. King after king piled on more blocks, territories, vassal states, ambitious sons, but forgot to reinforce the base. Family feuds were as common as trade negotiations, with brothers and sons vying for power like contestants on a particularly cutthroat reality show. The throne room might as well have had a revolving door, as coups and assassinations became the order of the day. Nothing says, "Welcome to the family," like a dagger in the back. Meanwhile, the economy was taking a nosedive, and not just because of the internal squabbles. Trade routes were disrupted by conflicts, and the empire's legendary iron monopoly wasn't the golden goose it once was. Picture iron as the 8-track of materials, once revolutionary, now a bit passé. Neighboring powers were catching up, and the Hittites found themselves scrambling to maintain their edge. Enter the Sea Peoples, the mysterious marauders who swept across the Mediterranean like a historical plot, twist no one saw coming. These enigmatic invaders are the stuff of legend, with theories about their origins ranging from displaced Trojan warriors to disgruntled Mycenaean villagers. They hit the Hittite Empire like a storm of historical mischief-makers, attacking coastal cities and cutting off vital trade routes. It was as if the Hittites were hosting a lavish banquet and the Sea Peoples crashed the party, raiding the buffet and smashing the fine china. The combination of internal discord and external threats proved fatal. The Hittite capital, Hadusa, was sacked and burned, leaving little more than ashes and broken dreams. For a civilization that had mastered the art of wielding iron and influence, it was a humbling end. The empire fractured into smaller Neo-Hittite states, which lingered on like faded rock stars playing small-town gigs after the glory days have passed. Yet, as we sift through the ruins and remnants, it's clear that the Hittites left an indelible mark on the ancient world. While they might not have the Hollywood glamour of the Egyptians, their legacy is as multifaceted as a Hittite legal code. They were the ancient Near East's unsung innovators, bringing iron to the forefront and setting the stage for the Iron Age. Their legal and diplomatic practices influenced future civilizations, like a blueprint for governance before governance was cool. In terms of lessons, the Hittites teach us that empires are like soufflés, impressive but precarious. One wrong move, and it's all deflated hopes and scrambled ambitions. They remind us that power is as much about perception as reality, and that even the strongest materials can be brittle when not properly supported. The Hittites wielded iron with the finesse of a maestro, but in the end, it was their internal fractures and external pressures that orchestrated their downfall. And so, as the curtain falls on the Hittite saga, we find a civilization that was as complex as it was dynamic, a tale of rise and fall that echoes through history's corridors. They may not have the blockbuster movies or tourist-attracting pyramids, but the Hittites were pivotal players in a game that shaped the ancient Near East. Their story is a reminder that even in decline, there is a legacy that persists, a testament to human ingenuity and the relentless march of history. You're jolted awake by the kind of bell that sounds like it belongs to a fire station, not a place of rest and recovery. Welcome to the Victorian Sanatorium, where the day begins at the ungodly hour of 5:30 a.m. As you blink away the remnants of sleep, you realize there's no snooze button, no leisurely scroll through social media. Just the cold, hard reality of a rigid schedule that's more unyielding than a Victorian corset. The first order of business is an ice-cold bath, a therapeutic ritual that's as appealing as a root canal without anesthesia. It's meant to invigorate the senses and jumpstart your health, but really, it's just a frosty reminder that comfort is not on today's menu. This isn't a spa day, after all. It's the late 19th century, and the sanatorium is the heart, or rather, cold. New health trends sweeping through industrial cities like London and Manchester. With the Industrial Revolution belching smoke and stress into the air, these institutions promised a return to nature and health. They were the wellness retreats of their day, minus the avocado toast. Once you're suitably chilled, it's time to dress in the uniform of the day, a set of loose, drab hospital garments that have all the flair of a beige wall. Don't even think about reaching for your phone. It's 1885, and the closest you'll get to technology is the ticking of a grandfather clock. Breakfast is served promptly at 6:00 a.m., but don't expect Eggs Benedict or a latte. Instead, you're greeted with gruel that makes Oliver Twist's bowl of porridge look like a 5-star meal. Eating is done in silence, under the watchful eyes of the staff, who ensure that no crumb goes unconsumed. The sanatorium is a product of its time, a reflection of the era's obsession with health and order. During the 19th century, these institutions sprouted up like mushrooms after rain, driven by a belief that nature could cure the ills of industrialization. As cities grew and factories multiplied, so did ailments like tuberculosis and nervous exhaustion, the catch-all diagnosis for anything that couldn't be explained. Sanatoriums offered a respite from the smog and chaos, a chance to breathe fresh air and engage in structured inactivity. But let's not romanticize it too much. While the idea was to heal, the reality was often more about control. The regimented schedule, the enforced quiet, the isolation from the outside world, it all smacks of an experiment in discipline rather than a nurturing environment. Patients, or inmates, depending on how you look at it, were expected to adhere to a timetable that left little room for personal liberty or spontaneous joy. It's wellness by way of dictatorship, wrapped in a veneer of medical authority. The sanatoriums were popular, though, attracting everyone from the genuinely ill to the rich and restless. In an age before antibiotics, they promised relief where traditional medicine often failed. Florence Nightingale might have preferred fresh air and cleanliness, But here, the belief was that a mix of nature and strict regimentation could cure what ailed you. Some of these places were luxurious, catering to the upper class with more amenities than the average citizen could dream of. Others were more like prison camps, offering little more than the basics in a bid to purify and reform their charges. By mid-morning, you're shuttled off to a session of therapeutic exercise, a term that's less about breaking a sweat and more about moving in a way that wards off the very spirit of idleness. It's a far cry from a modern gym session. Think more along the lines of synchronized stretching or calisthenics, all under the stern gaze of a supervisor who ensures you hit every mark. This isn't about personal fitness. It's about conformity to the regimen. The Sanatorium believes that a disciplined body leads to a disciplined mind, and they're not taking any chances. All of this might seem bizarre through a modern lens, but remember, we're dealing with an era that also believed in leech therapy and phrenology. The Victorians had a knack for mixing pseudoscience with genuine breakthroughs, and the Sanatorium was no different. It was part of a broader movement towards public health reform, as governments and philanthropists began to recognize the need to address the living conditions that led to widespread disease and debilitation. In cities choked by pollution, the allure of the countryside and its supposed curative properties was strong. Yet, the question remains, were these practices truly for health, or more about control? It's a fine line, and one that sanatoriums teetered on with the grace of a tightrope walker, control disguised as care. It's a theme that echoes through history, from workhouses to asylums. The sanatorium was just another chapter in that story, a place where the lines between treatment and tyranny blurred. So, as you trudge through the morning routine, you might find yourself questioning the wisdom of these methods. But for the Victorians, it was all part of a grand experiment in health, one that promised to cure the body, and perhaps optimistically, the soul. It's a curious blend of hope and hubris, a testament to an age that sought order in an increasingly chaotic world. And as the morning sun casts its pale light across the sanatorium grounds, you can't help but wonder if they ever truly found what they were looking for. Now, as the morning sun climbs higher, casting a pale glow over the sanatorium grounds, you're about to discover the unwritten rulebook that governs this peculiar institution. The rigid social hierarchy. This isn't just a place for healing. It's a microcosm of Victorian society, with its own ladder of privilege and power. At the top of this social food chain are the wealthy patients, ensconced in private rooms that are practically palatial compared to the shared wards where the less fortunate languish. If you're lucky enough to be among the affluent few, your treatment includes personalized attention, a diet that borders on indulgent, and perhaps even the luxury of a daily stroll without a chaperone breathing down your neck. But let's be real. The rest of us would likely find ourselves in the latter category, tucked away in a communal dormitory where privacy is as scarce as a Victorian gentleman's sense of humor. These shared spaces are a far cry from the opulent chambers of the elite, more reminiscent of a military barracks with their rows of identical beds and the constant hum of coughs and whispered laments. It's a stark reminder that even within a supposed sanctuary of health, status remains a defining factor. The Victorian era was nothing if not a masterclass in class consciousness, and the sanatorium was no exception. Now, let's talk economics, because, as with everything in history, money makes the world go round. Running a sanatorium is no cheap affair. The cost of maintaining such a facility could rival the GDP of a small country, or at least a moderately successful Victorian tea shop. We're talking about expenses for staff salaries, medical supplies, food, and that ever-necessary ice for the morning baths. Wealthy patients were charged handsomely for their stay, sometimes paying upwards of £100 a month, an amount that could feed a lower-class family for a year back then. For comparison, a skilled worker might earn only £60 annually, making the sanatorium a playground of the rich or a desperate last resort for everyone else. Funding these health resorts often required a mix of private investment and charitable donations. Philanthropists with deep pockets and a penchant for public health reform would sometimes step in, seeing these establishments as a way to cleanse not just the lungs, but the soul of the nation. The appeal was twofold. They could help the unwell and polish their own reputations at the same time. It's the Victorian version of a win-win, with a side of self-congratulatory smugness. Despite the financial gymnastics required to keep these places afloat, sanatoriums were a booming business. By the late 19th century, they darted the countryside like mushrooms after a rainstorm, but behind the serene facades and promises of healing lay the Victorian obsession with order and control. Mental health was a murky field, shrouded in misunderstanding and stigma. The prevailing belief was that mental illness was a moral failing or a consequence of modern life's pressures. Treatments ranged from the benign, like gardening and fresh air, to the downright medieval, such as isolation and electrotherapy. If you were wealthy and suffering from hysteria or neurasthenia, you might have been prescribed rest cures and spa treatments that would make a modern wellness retreat blush. Meanwhile, poorer patients could find themselves subjected to harsher regimes, with less emphasis on comfort and more on discipline. It was a time when the lines between care and control blurred, when mental health treatment was as much about maintaining societal norms as it was about genuine well-being. The disparity in treatment wasn't just about economics. It reflected the broader societal views on class and worth. Wealthier patients were seen as deserving of gentler care, their ailments romanticized as the burdens of refined sensibilities. In contrast, the poor were often perceived as having brought afflictions upon themselves through moral weakness or lack of discipline. It's a tale as old as time. The rich are delicate flowers needing tender care, while the poor must be toughened up or reformed. These attitudes seeped into the very architecture of the sanatoriums. The layout often mirrored the class divides, with the well-to-do enjoying rooms with views of lush gardens, nature heals, remember, and the less affluent relegated to the less picturesque parts of the building. This division was not just physical, but psychological, reinforcing the idea that one's social standing could dictate the quality of care received. Yet, despite these glaring inequalities, sanatoriums maintained a certain allure. They promised a respite from the ills of industrialization, a return to simplicity and health. In an age where scientific progress was rapidly advancing, offering both hope and fear, the sanatorium stood as a beacon of the era's conflicting desires, the need for control and the yearning for liberation from the chaos of modern life. As you navigate the sanatorium's halls, you can't help but marvel at the contradictions. Here is a place that claims to heal but often confines, that preaches equality in health but practices division. It's a reminder that history, much like the Victorians themselves, is a complex beast, full of grand ideals and gritty realities. So, as the day unfolds, with its regimented activities and silent meals, remember that this microcosm of 19th century life is a reflection of a society grappling with its own growing pains, caught between the dawn of modernity and the shadows of its past. And speaking of contradictions, it's time to explore the culinary curiosities that define a Victorian sanatorium lunch. Now, if you're imagining a quaint picnic with cucumber sandwiches and a spot of tea, let me stop you right there. Lunch here is less about flavor and more about feeding the beast of Victorian nutritional science, a beast with all the charm of a surly cat on a rainy day. Welcome to the era where food was as much an experiment as it was nourishment. Picture yourself sitting down to a meal that might include boiled mutton, a dish so devoid of seasoning it makes oatmeal look like haute cuisine. But don't worry, there's always a side of stewed prunes to keep things interesting. The star of this show, however, is not the food itself, but the theories undergirding it all, which are as fascinating as they are misguided. Victorian dietary wisdom was a curious blend of pseudoscience and genuine innovation, with a dash of cultural anxiety thrown in for good measure. It was the golden age of nutritional theories, led by figures like William Banting, whose low-carb diet plan was the keto of its day, though minus the Instagram influencers. Banting's idea was simple: cut out bread and potatoes, and watch the pounds melt away. Never mind that potatoes were a staple for the working class. In the eyes of the Victorian upper crust, anything that promised to slim the waistline was worth its weight in gold. The sanatorium menu was steeped in the era's fascination with caloric control and food as a tool for moral improvement. The thought was that a disciplined diet would lead to a disciplined mind, echoing the same control fetish that permeated other aspects of Victorian life. If you were lucky or unlucky, depending on your taste buds, you might even encounter the infamous Graham bread, a precursor to modern whole grain that was as tough as the Victorian work ethic itself. Invented by Sylvester Graham, this bread was part of a broader movement known as dietary reform, which aimed to curb everything from appetite to libido. But let's not overlook the elephant in the room: meat, or rather the lack thereof. While the Victorian elite could indulge in roast beef and game, the sanatorium's offerings were often sparse, reflecting broader economic realities. Meat was expensive, costing as much as 10 shillings per pound, depending on the cut and location. For context, a laborer might earn just 15 shillings a week, making meat a luxury rather than a staple. In sanatoriums, the focus was on stretching resources, so meals leaned heavily on grains and vegetables, which were cheaper and, in theory, healthier. And here's where things get weird. The Victorians were obsessed with digestion. The idea was that a clean gut led to a clean mind, a belief that married medical theory with moral judgment. This led to some truly bizarre practices, like the near-religious fervor for bran and other fibrous foods. The sanatorium's menu often featured a generous helping of what we now call roughage, all in the name of keeping things moving, if you catch my drift. This focus on digestion was part of a broader cultural anxiety about health and morality. In a rapidly industrializing world, the gut became a battleground for societal fears about decadence, impurity, and the loss of traditional values. The Victorian diet, with its emphasis on plainness and restraint, was a form of moral signaling, a way to show that one was above the excesses of modern life. It was less about actual nutrition and more about the optics of being virtuous. Yet, for all its quirks, Victorian dietary science did lay the groundwork for some genuine advances. The era saw the beginnings of nutrition as a science, with figures like Justus von Liebig pioneering the study of food chemistry. His work on the nutritional value of proteins, fats, and carbohydrates helped shift the conversation from mere sustenance to the mechanics of human metabolism. But let's not pretend it was all scientific rigor. For every Liebig, there was a crackpot theory about how to eat your way to enlightenment. One such notion was Fletcherism, named after Horace Fletcher, who believed that chewing each bite 32 times unlocked its nutritional potential. It's hard not to imagine a room full of patients gnawing like determined chipmunks, all under the watchful eye of a matron, ensuring no one dared swallow prematurely. The sanatorium's relationship with food was a microcosm of larger societal trends, an attempt to impose order on the chaos of modern life. It was an era of contrasts, progress and superstition, indulgence and restraint, all wrapped up in the simple act of eating. As you pick at your plate with a bemused smile, it's clear that the Victorians had a complicated relationship with their meals. They were simultaneously a product of their time and a reflection of its anxieties. So, as the lunch bell tolls, signaling the end of this culinary adventure, remember that each mouthful is a lesson in history. It's a reminder that while we may chuckle at the absurdities of the past, we're often just as prone to our own dietary delusions. The Victorians, with their peculiar menus and earnest beliefs, were simply navigating the complexities of a changing world, much like we do today. As you push back from the table, wondering if you'll ever look at stewed prunes the same way, there's a comfort in knowing that you're part of a long tradition of humans trying, and often failing, to make sense of their plates. But don't get too comfortable. The day is far from over, and the sanatorium has more lessons to teach. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the mysteries of this Victorian institution, one eccentricity at a time. Lunch has barely settled when you're shuffled off to the next installment of Victorian wellness, treatments and therapies that are more like science fiction than healthcare. The sanatorium, after all, is not just a place for rest and gruel. It's a laboratory of human experimentation, where the boundaries between medical science and mad science blur more often than London fog. First up on the docket is the infamous rest cure, a treatment that sounds deceptively pleasant. You might think it involves lounging about with a good book and a cup of tea, but no. We're talking about enforced bed rest that makes a coma look like a Pilates session. This brainchild of Dr. Silas Weir Mitchell was prescribed primarily to women suffering from hysteria, neurasthenia, or any affliction that made them inconveniently emotional. The idea was simple: do absolutely nothing. And I mean nothing. No reading, no writing, no knitting, just lying there like a decorative Victorian pillow. Mitchell believed this would fortify the nervous system, But in reality, it was more about controlling unruly women than curing them. Virginia Woolf and Charlotte Perkins Gilman, both subjected to this cure, later critiqued it in their works, highlighting its oppressive nature. Spoiler alert, being idle didn't solve their creative frustrations. Now, if bed rest was the carrot, then electrotherapy was the stick. Yep, electricity, still a marvel of the age, was harnessed for its supposed healing powers. Picture a room filled with buzzing contraptions that look like they belong in a steampunk nightmare. Patients were strapped to these machines and given jolts of electricity to treat everything from depression to digestive issues. It was like a Victorian reboot of Frankenstein, only less about reanimation and more about misguided optimism. The theory that a bit of a spark could reset the nervous system. In practice, it was about as effective as trying to charge your smartphone with a potato. But hey, it was the 1880, and anything that glowed or buzzed was considered cutting edge. As if that wasn't enough, there's the hydrotherapy, a practice that sounds soothing until you realize it's more akin to waterboarding than a spa day. Patients were subjected to dousing, cold plunges, and the infamous wet sheet pack, where you were wrapped like a soggy burrito in damp sheets and left to contemplate your life choices. The rationale behind this was as murky as the water they used. Proponents claimed it calmed the nerves and detoxified the body, but let's be honest, if you were hysterical before, being dunked in cold water would hardly help your mood. Of course, the sanatorium couldn't ignore the allure of the exotic, leading us to the light cure. Yes, the Victorians were early adopters of phototherapy, though not for the reasons you might think. Sunlight exposure was believed to treat everything from tuberculosis to depression, with patients encouraged to bask in the rays like lizards on a rock. It sounds almost sensible until you remember that they also thought staring at a bright light might cure blindness. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Then we have the ultimate in medical theater, bloodletting and leech therapy. These ancient practices were still hanging around like unwanted guests at a party, despite the growing body of evidence against them. The idea was to balance the body's humors, a concept as outdated as using leeches to predict the weather. Yet, old habits die hard, and many a sanatorium patient found themselves on the receiving end of a lancet or covered in squirming leeches, all in the name of balance. It's enough to make you appreciate modern medicine, which at least saves the bloodletting for metaphorical purposes. And let's not forget the psychological treatments that would make Freud raise an eyebrow. Asylums and sanatoriums alike experimented with methods to reform the mind, methods that often involved a great deal of coercion. Solitary confinement and sensory deprivation were not uncommon, based on the belief that isolation could reset a troubled mind. Spoiler alert, it didn't, and often left patients more disturbed than when they entered. By now, you're probably wondering how any of this was justified. The short answer is a heady mix of optimism, ignorance, and the Victorian penchant for spectacle. Medicine was in transition, caught between ancient practices and burgeoning scientific inquiry. The sanatoriums were microcosms of this chaos, where anything new was worth a try, especially if it came with the promise of a cure. But more often than not, these treatments served as a reminder of the era's blind spots. A belief in control masked as care, a faith in technology not yet understood, and a societal structure that prioritized order over empathy. Yet, amidst the absurdity, these institutions were stepping stones to modern medicine. They forced questions that needed asking, about the mind, the body, and how we treat both. By grappling with these issues, often in misguided ways, they paved the way for the medical advances we take for granted today. So, as the afternoon shadows lengthen and the sanatorium's peculiar rituals march on, keep in mind that what seems bizarre now was once cutting edge. This is the world of the Victorian sanatorium, a place where the line between healing and harm was as thin as a sheet of wet linen. But don't get too comfortable. This ride through medical history isn't over yet. Stay tuned as we continue to unravel the mysteries and missteps of this curious era, one peculiar practice at a time. As the sun begins to set on this day in the Victorian sanatorium, you might be tempted to romanticize it all, imagining it as a quaint chapter in the storybook of medical history. But let's yank off those rose-tinted glasses for a moment and take a good, hard look at the harsh realities faced by patients within these walls. where dreams of recovery often collided with the cold, hard floor of reality. While the sanatoriums of the 19th century painted a picture of pastoral serenity, they could be anything but serene. They were more like gilded cages, where patients were caught in the crossfire of an evolving medical field and society's moralistic gaze. The truth is, many of those who found themselves here were not just battling tuberculosis or exhaustion, but also the stigma of mental illness, which was seen less as a health condition and more as a moral failing. It's important to remember that in the Victorian era, mental illness was often considered a personal flaw rather than a medical condition. People suffering from conditions like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder were frequently labeled as lunatics and tucked away, out of sight and out of mind, in these institutions. This wasn't a place where you checked involuntarily. It was often where you ended up when society decided you didn't fit its norms. In fact, the 1880 saw a surge in the number of people institutionalized, not because of a sudden epidemic of mental illness, but because of a societal push towards order and conformity. The Lunacy Act of 1890 in Britain, for instance, was a testament to this mindset, giving more power to authorities to commit individuals, often on flimsy grounds. It was a time when a woman could be institutionalized for something as trivial as being difficult or unruly. The sanatorium was less a sanctuary and more a social tool for control. So, what did these institutions do for mental health policies? Interestingly, they were the unwitting architects of the reform movement in the early 20th century. By the turn of the century, the glaring deficiencies and ethical quandaries of sanatoriums became impossible to ignore. The Victorian obsession with control, while misguided, laid the groundwork for a critical conversation about the treatment of mental illness. The abuses and failures of these institutions spurred reformers to advocate for change, leading to the development of more humane treatments and the eventual rise of community care models. Fast forward to today, and the ghosts of Victorian sanatoriums still haunt our mental health policies. They serve as a cautionary tale, a reminder that while our understanding of mental illness has advanced, the stigma and misconceptions haven't entirely vanished. The transition from asylums to modern psychiatric hospitals was a long and winding road, marked by trial, error, and the occasional leap of faith. For instance, the deinstitutionalization movement of the 20th century was directly influenced by the failings of places like Victorian sanatoriums. As psychiatric medications improved and the horrors of institutional life became public knowledge, there was a massive push to close these facilities and treat patients in more community-based settings. By the 1960s, this shift was in full swing, driven by a mix of human rights advocacy and economic considerations. After all, running large institutions was expensive and often ineffective. Yet, even as we've moved away from the physical confines of sanatoriums, the legacy of these institutions persists in the form of systemic challenges. Today, mental health care still struggles with issues of accessibility, stigma, and funding. The echoes of the past remind us that while we've made strides, there's a long way to go in ensuring that mental health care is both comprehensive and compassionate. Reflecting on the Victorian sanatoriums, one might be tempted to think of them as a blip in history, an evolutionary dead end in the journey of medical science. But that would be missing the point. They were a necessary, albeit painful, step in the evolution of mental health care. They forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about how we treat those who don't fit neatly into the boxes we've constructed. So, as the day in our imaginary sanatorium comes to a close, and you tuck yourself into that stiff, comfortable bed, consider this. The lessons of the past are not just about what was done wrong, but also about how we can do better. The Victorian sanatoriums were a mirror reflecting the anxieties and prejudices of their time. They remind us that progress is often messy, and that the path to enlightenment is paved with the cobblestones of our past mistakes. And as you drift off to sleep, let these thoughts linger. History is not just a collection of dusty old stories. It's a living, breathing entity that shapes who we are today. The sanatoriums, with their peculiar blend of hope and hubris, are a testament to the complexities of humanity's quest for health and order. They are a reminder that while we may stumble and falter, each misstep is also an opportunity to find our footing and move forward with greater wisdom and empathy. With that, let's close the book on this day in the Victorian Sanatorium, a chapter in history that's both sobering and enlightening. Sleep well, and remember, the past is never as far away as it seems. A time long before protein shakes and Instagram fitness influencers, there was Sparta, a city-state that decided flexing wasn't just for showing off, but a way of life. Nestled in the rugged hills of the Peloponnese, Sparta was an unlikely candidate for greatness. Yet it transformed into a powerhouse of military prowess, and not because they were particularly fond of the color red or the smell of leather. The story of the Spartan military begins in the 8th century BCE. And no, they didn't just wake up one day and decide to wear crimson cloaks and carry spears like it was the latest fashion trend. Sparta's journey to becoming the ancient version of a cross-fit cult started with necessity, not vanity. You see, in the early days, Sparta was just another Greek city-state trying to find its place in the sun. It wasn't until they tangled with the Messenians, a neighboring group that, let's face it, probably just wanted to be left alone, that things started to heat up. The Messenian Wars, which kicked off in the late 8th century BCE, were like the ancient world's version of a neighborhood dispute, only with a lot more at stake than who gets to borrow the lawnmower. The First War itself dragged on for nearly 2 decades, from around 743 to 724 BCE. That's right, folks, 20 years of skirmishes over land, power, and possibly who had the better olives. Now, why did this matter? Because the Messenians were no pushovers. After years of fighting, they were finally subdued and turned into helots, or state-owned serfs, who worked the land so the Spartans could focus on their newfound passion, war. The helots outnumbered the Spartans by significant margins, with some estimates suggesting a ratio as high as 7-1. You don't need a PhD to see that those numbers aren't exactly encouraging if you're the one being outnumbered. This demographic imbalance was a wake-up call for the Spartans, kind of like when you realize you've been binge-watching a series for 6 hours straight and should probably do something productive. Faced with a potentially explosive situation where the helots could rise against their masters, Sparta decided that a strong military was not just an option, but a necessity. This wasn't just about keeping the helots in check, though that was a big part of it. It was about creating a society where every citizen was prepared to fight at a moment's notice, a society where the art of war was as natural as breathing. And thus, the Spartan military machine was born, not out of love for combat, but out of sheer survival instinct. The socio-political climate of early Sparta was a curious blend of democracy and oligarchy, like mixing quinoa with chocolate chips. Odd, but somehow it worked. Their government was headed by 2 kings, which sounds like a recipe for disaster, but was actually a brilliant move. One king could lead the army abroad, while the other stayed back to keep an eye on things at home. This dual kingship, along with a council of elders known as the Gerousia and an assembly of citizens, created a unique political structure that supported their military ambitions. You could almost say it was like a well-oiled machine, if the machine was made of bronze and carried a spear. But what truly set Sparta apart wasn't just its political savvy, or its ability to turn out soldiers like a conveyor belt cranking out action figures. It was their relentless approach to training. The Agoge, Sparta's infamous education and training program, was less of a school and more of a boot camp from hell. Boys were taken from their families at the tender age of 7 and thrust into a brutal regimen designed to turn them into warriors. We're talking long marches, little food, and a healthy dose of corporal punishment. It wasn't fun, but it was effective. By the time they graduated at 20, these young men were ready for anything, except possibly a career in diplomacy. What's fascinating is how the Spartans' obsession with military excellence seeped into every aspect of their lives. Their society was built around the idea of creating the perfect soldier. Spartan women, who were given more freedom and responsibility than their counterparts in other Greek city-states, were expected to produce strong warriors. They participated in physical training themselves, because who doesn't love a partner who can spart you in the gym? Spartan society was a fascinating blend of rigid discipline and unexpected freedoms, all in service to the state and its military goals. As much as we love the romantic idea of Spartans as noble warriors, the truth is a bit more complex. They were indeed formidable fighters, but their society was harsh. their lives often brutal, and their system depended on the subjugation of a large population of helots. The legend is captivating, but the reality was a daily grind of discipline and duty. The Spartans didn't become legendary because they wanted to. They did it because they had to. And so, a small city-state in ancient Greece, through a mix of desperation, ingenuity, and sheer force of will, carved out a place in history as one of the greatest military powers of the ancient world. The origins of the Spartan military aren't just a tale of warriors. It's a story of survival, adaptation, and the relentless pursuit of excellence. As we dive deeper into their story, remember, the Spartans weren't just warriors. They were a product of their times, their challenges, and their choices. As we step further into the world of Spartan training, let's shake off any quaint notions that this was a childhood of hopscotch and hide-and-seek. Instead, imagine a 7-year-old boy, barely out of toddlerhood, being ripped from the comfort of his mother's embrace and tossed into the crucible of the agoge. This wasn't just any schoolyard experience. It was the ancient equivalent of a survival reality show, only the stakes were life and death, not just a chance to win 1,000,000 drachmas. The agoge was a state-sponsored, military-style boot camp with a curriculum that would make even the toughest modern drill sergeant weep into his protein shake. Here, young Spartan boys were groomed into warriors through a relentless diet of physical training, mental fortitude, and a dash of state-sanctioned brutality. And let's not sugarcoat it. This wasn't about building self-esteem or discovering your inner artist. It was about forging a human weapon, plain and simple. The daily life of a Spartan trainee was a Spartan affair, pun fully intended. Mornings didn't start with a warm breakfast and a pat on the head. Instead, these young warriors in training faced cold mornings with nothing but their wits and whatever they could scavenge. The Spartan diet was less about nutritional balance and more about teaching self-reliance. Hungry? Well, better get clever about finding your next meal. Stealing was encouraged, but getting caught. That was a one-way ticket to a beating, a lesson in stealth, not ethics. Physical endurance was the name of the game, and the agoge had it in spades. Picture exhausting runs, wrestling matches, and mark battles that could leave a bruised ego and a bruised everything else. The trainee's only uniform was a single cloak, worn year-round, because why bother with luxuries like shoes or proper clothing when you could just toughen up instead? These sartorial choices also doubled as a practical lesson in stoicism, because learning to endure heat, cold, and discomfort was just another Tuesday in Spartanland. But the agoge wasn't just about brawn. There was an unexpected focus on cunning and wit. Young Spartans were taught to be sharp both in mind and tongue. Critical thinking and quick decision-making were as prized as a well-thrown spear. After all, a deadpan quip could be just as disarming in a debate as a sword in battle. The educational aspect of the agoge was surprisingly sophisticated, with lessons in music, dance, and poetry. Yes, these warriors could also carry a tune and wax poetic, because why not add lyricist to your skill set when you're already a killing machine? Now, let's talk about the infamous Spartan concept of come back with your shield or on it. This wasn't just locker room bravado, it was a societal expectation. A Spartan warrior never left the battlefield in disgrace. If you lost your shield, it meant you'd likely turned tail and ran, and that was the ultimate sin in a society built on valor and unity. Shields were not just protective gear, they were symbols of collective strength. In battle, your shield protected not just you, but the warrior next to you, a reminder that Spartan success relied on cohesion and mutual defense. Returning without it was a failure of the highest order, one that not only tarnished your personal honor, but also shamed your family and city-state. But let's not get too swept up in the romance of it all. The harsh reality was that the agoge was a gauntlet that not every boy survived. Weaklings were weeded out, and only the strongest emerged as full-fledged members of the Spartan military. This was a society where survival of the fittest wasn't just a catchphrase, it was policy. By the time they reached the age of 20, those who endured graduated not with diplomas, but with a place in the ranks, ready to serve Sparta until the age of 60. Yes, 60. Talk about job security. The economic backdrop of this grueling system is just as telling. The Spartans weren't just building warriors. They were managing their human resources with the precision of a modern-day corporation. A Spartan soldier's education was funded by the state, which meant that each successful graduate was an investment. These men were expected to contribute to the state's military prowess, ensuring Sparta's dominance and, crucially, keeping those helots in line. This was a society that understood the value of a well-trained army, not just in terms of defense, but as a means of projecting power and maintaining control. Socially, the agoge also reinforced the rigid class divisions within Sparta. Only Spartan males could partake in this rigorous training, creating an exclusive warrior class that held the reins of power. The helots, meanwhile, remained shackled to their role as the subjugated workforce, their labor supporting the Spartan war machine. This dichotomy was at the heart of Spartan society, a society built on the backs of the many for the benefit of the few. To wrap your head around the agoge, you have to appreciate the Spartan commitment to their ideals. Discipline, strength, and loyalty were more than just virtues. They were the bedrock of their entire civilization. The agoge was not just a school. It was a crucible that burned away weakness and forged what the Spartans hoped would be the ultimate soldier. It wasn't pretty, and it wasn't kind, but it was effective. And in the brutal world of ancient Greece, that was what mattered most. The Spartan training system is a fascinating window into a society that prioritized martial excellence above all else. It's easy to mythologize the Spartans as noble warriors, unyielding in the face of adversity. But behind the legend lies the sobering reality of a culture where the stakes were survival, and the cost was often paid in blood and toil. As we continue to peel back the layers of Spartan society, remember that the story of Sparta is as much about the men who wielded the spears as it is about the system that forged them. In the end, the Spartans didn't just train soldiers, they crafted an ideal, and for better or worse, they made it a reality. And speaking of crafting ideals, let's delve into how the Spartans didn't just stop at training warriors. They revolutionized the art of war itself. Welcome to the hoplite phalanx, the ancient world's answer to synchronized swimming, but with more pointy bits and fewer nose clips. This was the formation that made the Spartan army the top dog of ancient Greece, and it was as much about geometry as it was about guts. Picture this, a wall of bronze and muscle, moving as one. Each hoplite was a cog in a well-oiled machine, holding a shield in the left hand to protect not just themselves, but the warrior next to them. It was a strategy that took "I've got your back" to a whole new level. The key was the hoplon, a massive round shield that was as much a work of art as it was a defensive tool. It weighed in at around 16-20 pounds. Talk about heavy lifting. But the weight was worth it. Well, weight in gold when it came to battlefield survival. This phalanx was more than just a formation. It was a philosophy of war. The idea was simple: strength in unity. A single hoplite was vulnerable, but a phalanx was nearly impenetrable. And when you're outnumbered 7-1 by helots, as the Spartans often were, ensuring your army was more than just the sum of its parts was critical. The phalanx was the ancient version of a trust-fall exercise, minus the motivational speaker, and with a bit more at stake than team-building points. Now, let's talk about cost, because all this martial excellence didn't come cheap. Think of the Spartan military as the ancient world's version of a defense contractor with a budget to match. Outfitting a single hoplite was an investment that ran a hefty sum, estimated at about 100 drachmas per soldier. Not exactly pocket change when you realize that a skilled worker might earn around 1 drachma per day. This was an economy of war where every shield, spear, and bronze cuirass was a line item on Sparta's balance sheet. But here's the kicker. While the equipment was costly, the real expense was in the upkeep of the Spartan way of life. The helots, with their forced labor, were the economic engine that powered Sparta's military machine. They provided the necessary agricultural output that allowed Spartan citizens to focus entirely on training and warfare. This is where the notion of the Spartan economy as a ruthless startup comes in. The helots were the underpaid interns, keeping the wheels turning while the Spartans lived the high-stakes life of a warrior class. And let's not forget the political angle. The Spartan system was as much about governance as it was about military prowess. Their dual kingship and council of elders ensured a streamlined decision-making process, particularly when it came to war. It's like having a board of directors where every member is a former Navy SEAL. Decisions were made with swift precision, allowing them to pivot quickly in response to threats. Forget parliamentary debates. In Sparta, if there was an issue, It was often settled on the battlefield, but there's a harsh truth behind the Spartan legend. Their society was inherently unstable. You see, while the Spartans were busy perfecting their war dance, their reliance on the Helots created a powder keg of social tension. The Helots weren't just passive observers in this militaristic opera. Occasional revolts were a grim reminder of their dissatisfaction and the precariousness of Spartan dominance. The Spartans had to be ever vigilant, not just of foreign threats, but of the simmering unrest within their own borders. And yet, despite, or perhaps because of, these challenges, the Spartan military system was a marvel of efficiency and innovation. Their focus on discipline, unity, and innovation made them a formidable force, one that left an indelible mark on military history. They were the ancient world's equivalent of a Silicon Valley startup, but instead of apps and algorithms, they were coding in courage and camaraderie. In the end, the Spartan military wasn't just about spears and shields. It was a complex network of social, economic, and political factors that all had to align perfectly to maintain their status. It was a high-wire act that they managed with ruthless efficiency and a touch of Spartan flair. As we continue our journey into the world of Sparta, keep in mind that the story is as much about spreadsheets as it is about spears, as much about the economy of war as the glory of battle. The Spartans didn't just fight. They strategized, innovated, and above all survived. And in the brutal world of ancient Greece, that was the ultimate victory. Which brings us to the myth, the legend, the Hollywood blockbuster, the unbeatable Spartan warrior. If you've ever seen a movie where Spartans charge into battle with abs so chiseled they could double as cheese graters, you're familiar with this trope. But while the idea of the Spartan warrior as an invincible force is as enticing as free pizza at a college dorm, the truth is a bit more nuanced. Let's start with the Battle of Thermopylae in 480 BCE, the ultimate underdog story that every action film loves to riff on. Here we have 300 Spartans standing their ground against the Persian army led by Xerxes, whose forces were so vast they supposedly drank rivers dry. In reality, the Persian army numbered somewhere around 100,000 to 150,000. Still a lot, but not quite the ocean of humanity that Herodotus would have us believe. And speaking of Herodotus, let's give a nod to the man who turned the Spartan last stand into the stuff of legend. His writings, sprinkled with a touch of creative flair, helped immortalize this battle as a David vs. Goliath tale, conveniently glossing over the fact that the Spartans weren't alone in their stand. In truth, the Spartan force was complemented by a few thousand Greek allies, including the Thespians and Thebans. These guys might not have had the Spartan brand recognition, but they were crucial to the effort. The infamous 300 was more like a few thousand, but who's counting when you're crafting a legend? The Spartans were indeed the backbone of the defense, but they weren't the lone stars of this ancient epic. The battle strategy was classic Spartan. Use the geography to your advantage. The Heart Gates, or Thermopylae, was a narrow pass where the Persians' numerical advantage was nullified. It was like funneling a herd of elephants through a revolving door, effective if you're trying to even the odds. For 2 days, the Greeks held off the Persian juggernaut, inflicting heavy casualties and proving that teamwork and strategic foresight could indeed stand against overwhelming numbers. But here's where the myth diverges from reality. The Spartans didn't march to Thermopylae intending to die in a blaze of glory. They were there to delay the Persians long enough for the rest of Greece to mobilize. It was essentially a tactical retreat, a calculated sacrifice, not some romanticized death wish. When a local Greek named Ephialtes betrayed them by revealing a hidden path to the Persians, the Spartans and their allies were outflanked. Leonidas, the Spartan king leading the forces, made the decision to stay and fight to the last man, knowing that the end was nigh. Despite their eventual defeat, the Spartans achieved their objective. They stalled Xerxes long enough for other Greek city-states to prepare for the oncoming storm. It wasn't the stuff of epic poetry, but it was a strategic success, turning a doomed defense into a rallying cry for Greek unity. And here's the kicker. The Spartan sacrifice didn't just resonate through history because Herodotus wrote it that way. It was a masterclass in ancient PR. By framing the narrative as one of noble sacrifice, Sparta not only galvanized Greek resistance, but also cemented its place in the pantheon of martial glory. Now, let's not sugarcoat the Spartans' record. Yes, they were fierce, but they weren't invincible. Take the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, where the Thebans, led by the brilliant tactician Epaminondas, handed the Spartans a humiliating defeat. The Theban army employed a new tactic, the oblique phalanx, which concentrated their forces on one side and overwhelmed the Spartan right flank. It was like watching a chess grandmaster dismantle a one-trick pony. This loss shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility, showing that even the most disciplined warrior could be outmaneuvered by innovation and strategy. What about the siege of Sphacteria during the Peloponnesian War in 425 BCE? Here, a small contingent of Spartans, stranded on the island of Sphacteria, was captured by Athenian forces. This was a blow to the Spartan image of unyielding resilience. The Spartans, who were supposed to fight to the death rather than surrender, found themselves in the embarrassing position of being prisoners of war. It's hard to maintain the aura of invincibility when your never surrender ethos is tossed aside like yesterday's chitin. And let's address the economic context, because even Spartan warriors need to eat. The cost of maintaining their military machine was hefty. The state provided for the soldiers, covering everything from their training to their equipment. But this came at the expense of innovation and adaptability. While other Greek states embraced new tactics and technologies, the Spartans clung to their tried-and-true methods, like a band refusing to play anything after their debut album. This inflexibility was both their strength and their Achilles heel. So, what's the takeaway from all this myth-busting? The Spartans were undoubtedly formidable warriors, but they were not the invincible demigods of Hollywood lore. Their success was built on a foundation of discipline, strategy, and a little help from their friends, both on the battlefield and in the annals of history. They understood the power of narrative, turning their martial exploits into timeless tales of heroism. As we continue to unravel the Spartan mystique, keep in mind that behind every legend lies a kernel of truth, wrapped in layers of exaggeration and myth-making. The real Spartans were as much products of their society as they were architects of their own legend. They weren't just warriors, they were storytellers, crafting a legacy that would echo through the ages, even if the reality was sometimes as brutal as their battlefield tactics. And with that, we'll dive deeper into how Spartan society navigated the precarious balance between military might and societal stability. The story isn't over yet. There's still so much more to explore about this fascinating culture that, for better or worse, turned war into an art form. Stay tuned as we peel back more layers of Spartan life, where the lines between legend and reality blur like distant mountains on the horizon. Speaking of Spartan life, let's examine what happens when your entire society is built around war, and then peace inconveniently breaks out, like showing up to a sword fight with a loaf of bread. The Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE was the first domino in the cascade of Spartan decline. Picture this: the Thebans, led by Epaminondas, an ancient military genius who probably could have solved a Rubik's Cube with his eyes closed, introduced the oblique phalanx. It was a formation that hit harder than your morning espresso, focusing force on a single point rather than spreading it thin. Spartan army, used to being the big fish in the Greek pond, found themselves outmaneuvered like a chess piece facing checkmate. This defeat didn't just bruise the Spartan ego, it shattered their aura of invincibility. Previously, they were the Greek world's go-to-bouncers, but now their services were being questioned. Their defeat at Leuctra was like realizing that your reliable old car has finally broken down after years of faithful service. It wasn't just a single loss, it was the start of a steep decline. And here's the kicker: the Theban victory didn't just end Spartan dominance in Greece, it turned the political landscape upside down faster than a Greek tragedy. The aftermath of Leuctra was a seismic shift in Greek politics. Sparta's allies, once loyal due to the fear of Spartan spears, began to question their allegiance. The Spartan Empire, such as it was, started to crumble like a poorly made baklava. The Thebans, once underdogs, rose to prominence, seizing the moment to expand their influence. Sparta, meanwhile, was left grappling with its own identity crisis. Imagine a society that had lived and breathed warfare suddenly finding itself in a world where its martial prowess was no longer the trump card it used to be. Economically, the decline hit harder than a Spartan boot camp. The Spartan system was a delicate balance, with the Helots providing the agricultural backbone that allowed the citizen soldiers to focus on flexing their military muscles. But with defeat, the Helots saw an opportunity. Revolts became more frequent, and the Spartan grip on their subjugated population began to slip. The economy, already teetering on the edge of sustainability, started to crack under the pressure. And let's talk about the political landscape, because things got messier than a toga party gone wrong. The dual kingship, once a model of efficiency, became a liability in a world that had moved past Spartan dominance. The Gerousia, that council of elders who were supposed to be the wise old owls of the Spartan state, found themselves out of touch with the rapidly changing reality. It was like watching a group of retired generals trying to understand social media trends. Awkward and a bit sad. The irony of Sparta's decline is that it was as much a victim of its own success as of external forces. The very system that had brought them to power, the rigid military training, the focus on discipline and unity, also made them inflexible in the face of change. While other city-states adapted, incorporating new strategies and technologies, Sparta remained stuck in its old ways, a relic of a bygone era. Their inability to innovate was like trying to win a modern war with bronze shields and spears valiant, but ultimately futile. Now, here's where the story takes a twist worthy of a plot line in a daytime drama. As Sparta's military might waned, it found a new role in the ancient world, as a curiosity, a living museum of former glory. By the time the Romans came knocking around 146 BCE, Sparta was no longer a significant military power, but rather a cultural relic, a place where tourists, yes, tourists, could visit and marvel at the remnants of a once great warrior society. The Romans, ever the pragmatists, preserved Sparta as a kind of ancient theme park, a reminder of the noble warrior ethos that had once commanded the respect of all Greece. And let's not forget the economic angle. With military dominance no longer bankrolling their society, the Spartans had to pivot. They began to capitalize on their storied past, selling their legend to anyone willing to pay for a taste of the Spartan lifestyle. It's a bit like a rock band going on a nostalgia tour decades after their last hit. Only instead of performing on stage, the Spartans were reenacting battle drills for wide-eyed spectators. The irony, of course, is that a society once allergic to anything resembling leisure became a hotspot for ancient thrill-seekers. In the end, what do we make of the Spartan legacy? They were a society that pushed the boundaries of what it meant to be a warrior, crafting an identity so intertwined with combat that when the fighting stopped, they struggled to find their footing. Their story is a cautionary tale about the perils of inflexibility, a reminder that even the mightiest can fall if they refuse to adapt. But let's not write them off entirely. The Spartans left an indelible mark on history, their legend a testament to the power of narrative. They taught us that while military might can build an empire, it's the stories we tell about that empire that endure. So, as we close the book on Sparta, let's remember them not just as warriors, but as architects of their own myth, a myth that, for better or worse, continues to captivate us to this day. And there you have it, folks, the rise and fall of Sparta, a tale of glory, grit, and the enduring power of legend. It's a story where the lines between myth and reality blur, leaving us with a legacy that's as complex as it is compelling. So next time you hear the call of "This is Sparta," remember the real story behind the battle cries, the story of a society that, for a time, turned war into an art form, only to find that peace was the ultimate test of their mettle.